Good afternoon and a heartfelt welcome to everyone who's taken the time to join us today. My name is Maria del Pilar Kaladeen. I'm an Associate Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in London. It's my pleasure to host the inaugural conference and lecture of the Ameena Gafoor Institute for the Study of Indentureship. It feels important to say that this institute, which is independent of any university, is a unique virtual space for scholars of indenture to come together. As you'll hear from my accent, I'm a Londoner, but my father was born in Guyana in 1938, 100 years after the first Indians arrived in his country. And if there's a message that I've taken from my dad's family, it's that of the emphasis on the next generation. And it's in that spirit that I want to welcome and thank every single speaker who has found time to come to present here today. But I especially want to welcome the early career researchers who are presenting. And I hope that we've succeeded in creating an open space for you and for your scholarship. And without any more preamble, I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, who is Lizzy Willmington. And Lizzy is a PhD candidate at Cardiff Law School. She'll be presenting her paper, Sending and Receiving Indentured Labour, the Example of Fiji.
Oh, are you able to let me
Yes.
share my screen? Oh, thanks.
Pop you on share screen, just 1 second.
Thanks.
Okay.
So yeah, hi everyone. My name is Lizzy. I'm in my final year of my PhD at Cardiff Law School in the Cardiff Law and Global Justice Research Centre. And I know my abstract said the example of Fiji, but I'm going to be presenting more on the Pacific region, focusing on Fiji and Queensland as well.
And stay with me, Lizzy, sorry, while I sort out your share screen.
Okay.
Wonderful, and you should be all good to share your screen now, thanks.
Okay, can everyone see that? Okay. Okay, great. So thanks very much for having me. And so I'll just jump straight in. So my title is Sending and Receiving Indentured Labour in the Example of the Pacific. So overall, my aim is to demonstrate how the migration practices of empire shaped global and local racial segregation and exclusion, particularly during the 19th and 20th centuries. They'll be doing this by exploring 3 modes of mobilities during the empire, so indentured island labour, indentured Indian labour, and free mobility of non-white subjects. So migration was a tool of territorial expansion of the British Empire, and the movement and settlement of people around the empire is one of the lasting legacies that continue to shape the world today. Indentureship was part of this migration, and while the majority of people migrated from India, there are multiple histories of indentureship. So further, it was made possible by creating an exception or division of British subjecthood, a concept that was a cornerstone of the British Empire, to legislate the mass movement of free labour as opposed to unfree labour of slavery that came before it. So the Pacific holds an interesting position in the history of indentureship, with 2 territories under British control that engaged in indentured labour, Fiji and Queensland. After annexation, indentured island labour was employed on the plantations in Queensland and before annexation in Fiji, and after annexation, Fijian plantations were laboured by indentured Indians, like most of the rest of the empire. So taking the Pacific as a focal point in this presentation, I'll be looking at how these practices of sending and receiving indentured labour shaped global and local racial segregation during the 19th and 20th century, how these mobilities were facilitated through the law, and how they were the beginnings of the development of immigration laws around the empire, particularly in the white settler nations. While I'll focus on the Pacific region and the laws developed in specific local contexts, I understand this very much as an international process and development, and so I'll be highlighting the international influences and explicit legal reproductions, particularly between the white settler nations. So I'll first explain what British subjected is, and then go on to indentured island labour, indentured Indian labour, and the absences of fracturing of subjected in these instances, and then the role of free movement and the rejection of equality of British subjects and development of immigration law to specifically exclude subjects of colour. So from the 18th century, anyone born within Britain, which included England, Scotland and Wales, was considered a British citizen or subject through the process of jus soli, or the right of the soil, so being born on British territory. Anyone born outside of Britain to a British father who was married to the mother, so it's very paternalistic, and within the marriage union, could also claim British citizenship through jus sanguis, or the right of blood, so inherited citizenship. And this could be claimed 2 generations back. Devyani Prabhat explains this was a decisive act. Jus sanguis was used to supplement jus soli in order to expand British citizenry. Citizenship was operated through subjected, which was granted by the Crown and required loyalty and allegiance to the Crown. Everyone within the realm of the British Empire was a subject of the British Crown, without choice. However, claims to political rights within Britain were unequal, largely across lines of religion and place of birth, and this instability caused ramifications around the empire, impacting the boundaries of legal subjected. The definition was pushed and adapted within the colonies, both for the convenience of the colonial administrators as well as through the agency of British subjects themselves. Prabhat argues this has 2 equalising factors, in theory at least. Firstly, it offered a transnational citizenship, and secondly, every person was equally a subject of the Crown. This equality was seen as the cornerstone to the Empire and later the Commonwealth. However, this equality did not bear out in practice. Not only were the freedoms and privileges utilised unequally, but hierarchies of subjecthood were enacted socially, culturally and legally throughout the empire. It was both an inclusive and porous term, allowing the rights that could be claimed and responsibilities of the British Crown to evolve and be applied differently across the different territories and time periods of the empire. The consequence was myriad rights and statuses, all under the name of British subjected. So how did indentureship impact British subjected, and what role did the Pacific play? So looking at indentured Pacific Island labour, Fiji and Queensland were the 2 territories within the region under British control, which engaged in indentured island labour. Before annexation, the British Council held oversight of recruitment of indentured labour to Fiji, but it was legally weak. Queensland was an established colony and had laws and regulations regarding labour conditions and recruitment, but they were limited to the Queensland jurisdiction. Therefore, the process of recruitment was largely left to unregulated British recruiters, and islanders were often lied to and kidnapped and taken to the plantations. It's also worth noting that the Queensland legislation and regulations were just sort of overseeing it. They didn't want any part in legislating the recruitment of non-white labourers to Queensland. So shorter contracts and better pay in Queensland meant that it was a preferable destination for labourers, and between 1863 and 1904, 61,000 islanders travelled to Queensland to work in the sugarcane fields and mines, which was a substantial portion of the region's population. However, regulations in Queensland contained islanders within plantation labour to prevent conflict from white employees or potential employees if they were to work in better paid jobs. Clothing, food and medical care were supposed to be provided, but due to the inadequate food, islanders often grew, hunted or fished their own food. Resistance from the white local communities meant medical care was provided on the plantations or through separate Pacific Island hospitals, creating further containment and segregation between islanders and white settlers. The plantations in Fiji were laboured by indentured islanders from outside of Fiji, and after annexation, the governor didn't allow Fijians to engage in plantation labour as a paternalistic measure to protect Fijians from plantation life. So there were considerable issues with the treatment of labourers, their payment and return travel, and the system wasn't sustainable. And generally, I found that Fijians are remarkably absent from the literature of indentureship, and though there is suggestion that they engaged in plantation labour in Queensland, and this may be because Fiji was a British protectorate before annexation, but so were other islanders in the region, such as the Solomon Island, which is where most labourers in Queensland came from. And as a protectorate, they weren't afforded the same rights as subjects. But after annexation, Fijians were British subjects, but people from India had long held this status, and it was through indentureship that this subjecthood became fractured. So after the abolition of slavery across the British Empire, excluding the territories controlled by the British East India Company, the plantations needed labourers to maintain the flow of trade and capital that was made possible through the industry of enslavement. The workers on the plantations were either those now freed from enslavement or increasingly newly indentured or contracted people from India, China, and to a lesser extent from West Africa and the Pacific. The Indian indentured system was implemented more broadly across the empire than plantation slavery had been. The recruitment of people from within the British Empire was made possible by creating an exception or dividing British subjecthood to legislate the mass movement of free labour, as opposed to the unfree labour of slavery. Clear distinctions needed to be made between enslaved African labour and indentured labour, given its recent abolition. Bonded labourers were recruited and shipped to the colonies and to work on the plantation for a set number of years. In return, they were promised wage, a small bit of land, or return to their place of origin. Between 1834 and 1920, almost 1.5 million people were recruited through the indentured scheme and laboured across the British Empire, with Indian workers making up 85%. The first legislation to regulate the mass movement of Indian indentured workers was ratified in 1838 by the British Parliament, crossing tightly over with the end of the abolition of slavery and the apprenticeship system. There was no legal precedent for the regulation of movement of free subjects, but Parliament felt it must take an interest in the economic migration of its subjects, especially given, to quote, the class of persons so engaging themselves, end quote. This regulation created an exemption or exception to the equal free movement of British subjects and allowed extreme control over the movement between territories and within territories during the indentured period. It was not till some 50 years into the system of indentureship that a definition of emigration or to emigrate was legislated narrowly in the Indian Emigration Act of 1883. And this labour was interpreted as manual and therefore meant for a particular class of person. And again, this created a category apart from British subjecthood, which could be restrictively controlled in order to maximise capital output and minimal personal, civil and economic potential. And this was the definition of emigration until 1915, just before the end of indentureship. So the first governor of Fiji was Arthur Gordon, who implemented indentured Indian labour to the island. Having held posts, the post of governor in Trinidad and Mauritius, which had been the testing ground for the new system, Gordon made clear his position to source plantation labour from India in his swearing-in ceremony. Fiji was the last place to receive indentured workers, and between 1879 and 1916, just over 60,000 indentured Indians arrived to the archipelago. There were 4 distinct and separate spaces of living in Fiji. So indigenous Fijians were kept in villages and village life on their own land. indentured Indians on the white settler-run plantations, and then time expired or free Indians could lease land from Fijians, and the European communities were on their own alienated lands. And great effort was made to separate these communities. Indentured workers were restricted to living in purpose-built houses, which were orderly lines within the plantation. And to quote Rashad Degahi, they said they were to be an ordered space, by their very nature artificial and regimented, barrack-like in appearance, end quote. Great efforts were also taken to separate the living quarters of bonded and unbonded Indian labourers, as indentured workers were leaving the lines to go and live in the free settlements, much against the managers and colonial administrators' desire for separation, control and order. While concern over the responsibility of the health of the indentured labourers was given as the reason to ensure all indentured labourers lived on the plantation, it was really to ensure managers were making the most out of their labourers and they weren't skipping their work obligations. Those who remained in Fiji after their contracts were seen as permanent settlers, but were able to gain land and manage small holdings, and produced about 30% of the island sugar by 1918. However, they could only lease land from Fijians rather than own land, and this continued the temporality of indentureship into their settlement and well beyond, as this continued to be the case till after independence. So as free people and outside the control and order of the plantations, the Indian population was governed strictly with pass laws, vagrancy laws and high taxes. In Mauritius, former contractors were liable for a monthly tax if unemployed and imprisoned if they didn't pay. Outside of the indentured system, free Indians were seen as competition within business, and these laws were a means to reduce the competition, keep Indians within the indentured system, or to encourage return to India. While most indentured workers were entitled to a return passage, planters would encourage further contracts to avoid the cost of new labour migration and their obligation in funding the return journey. And so, for example, almost all free Indians in Fiji, Mauritius and Trinidad had been indentured labourers. Free or unbonded migration from India across the British Empire was prominent. The rights of free Indians were becoming increasingly restricted, particularly in Natal, and the government wanted to restrict any further Indian migration into the territory. The Australian colonies had agreed to extend existing restrictions on Chinese nationals to people, to quote, of all coloured races, irrespective of their British subjecthood, and Natal intended to follow suit. However, the Colonial Office reserved the legislation on this point. The Colonial Office expressed their insistence that the legislation did not restrict explicitly based on colour or race, but rather against, and to quote, impecunious and ignorant immigrants, end quote. So therefore, it was a question of how it was stated rather than the intent of the legislation. And this was reaffirmed when the question of immigration controls on racialised British subjects was addressed when the Prime Ministers and Premiers of the self-governing White Dominions met with Joseph Chamberlain, the colonial minister, in London to celebrate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897. The colonial ministers attempted to continue the balancing act between upholding the concept of equality for all British subjects, irrespective of race, while also heeding the demands of the self-governing White Dominions. This was not well received by either the colonial prime ministers and premiers or the Indian population, to whom the restrictions were largely aimed at. This arguably demonstrates the diminishing role at the heart of empire, as well as a lack of understanding over the role race played in white dominions. In trying to give self-governing white dominions what they wanted, the British had deserted every racialised British subject. And to quote Laken Reynolds, the colonial secretary had made it clear that in India, that an Indian, as soon as he left his homeland, ceased to be a British subject. Further, the idea of the British subject was fading more and more each year, giving way to the global colour line. There was constant management of racialized populations across the whole of the British Empire, which is why the methods of control and management were shared among the territories and adapted to suit the local situations. The governing white dominions looked to each other, as well as the United States as a newly emancipated nation, in exercising self-governance, including with immigration controls. While literacy requirements were already in place in Massachusetts and Connecticut, the Mississippi Constitution allowed for a literacy requirement and comprehension test to suppress Black voting after doing so based on race had become unconstitutional. A number of southern states followed suit, as did Cape Colony in South Africa with the Franchise and Ballot Act 1892. The shift to immigration restrictions based on literacy as a means of racial exclusion also has an American history. Prior to the Civil War amendments in 1870, racial exclusion was explicit. Naturalized citizenship was the reserve for all free white persons in 1790, allowing for free mass migration from anywhere in Europe. From 1880, who qualified as white was redefined in order to exclude Southern and Eastern Europeans. This developed into literacy qualifications for citizenship, as it was thought that only Anglo-Saxons were blessed with the capacity of self-government, for which literacy was essential. And therefore, and also there was a low level of literacy among the populations which were desired for exclusion. So despite never formally passing into law in the United States because it was struck down, it was legislated across the British Empire. Natal passed a requirement for applicants to be able to write in any European language rather than their own language to exclude racialized British subjects and include European allies. The new Commonwealth of Australia followed suit with an explicit white Australia policy enshrined in its constitution, which allowed for special laws to be made for people of any race, as well as laws of immigration and emigration. Prime Minister Deakin made clear that this meant the prevention of migration into the country and detainment within the country along racial lines. This was realised in the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, which cited the Natal Act for the definition of prohibited immigrant, and the Pacific Island Labourers Act of 1901, two legislations which were key in implementing the White Australia policy. And this allowed for the mass deportation of Pacific Island labourers who had come to Queensland as indentured labourers, as discussed before. Despite protestation by Pacific Islanders between 1906 and 1908, 5,000 of the 7,500 population were deported for to their countries of origin. So they were now being seen to jeopardise the white labour and union movement within Australia. So to conclude, through these different modes of mobilities throughout the empire, namely indentured and free mobilities and settlement, one of the cornerstones of empire, British subjecthood, was manipulated and fractured. White settler dominions utilised this and differentiated between subjects along explicitly racial lines. Exercising their independence from London, some of the first acts were to restrict immigration and forced deportation of non-white British subjects and aliens from their territory, which enshrined the White Australia policy in law. Canada and New Zealand followed suit, as did South Africa, which had the most explicit policy of apartheid. Okay.
Thank you so much, Lizzy.
Great.
Let me just take you down so I can introduce Rhys. That's fantastic. And Rhys, can I just confirm you're able to share screen?
Yeah, I can give it a go.
That's wonderful. So our next paper is from Rhys. Anil Madden is a PhD student at the London School of Economics. And Rhys's paper, one second, sorry, Rhys.
Right.
I've just lost my auto cue, Rhys, but it's fine because I have a backup. So Rhys's paper is entitled Indian Nationals in Guyana, a reflection on Indian migration after indenture. Thank you very much, Rhys.
That's all right, thank you. And yeah, thanks everybody for sort of everyone involved in organising this. Can I just check that you can see it all right? Is that all coming up fine?
All good, thanks.
Yeah, I also just want to say thanks for giving me the space to do something which is quite personal and also quite work in progress, and I recognise sits at sort of the edge of literature and sort of scholarship on indenture, but hopefully it's going to provide some interesting points to think about. So yeah, anyway, I'll just crack on. All right, so this paper follows a call by Lamar Marine in his 2018 book on the Indian Caribbean for a greater attention to Indian movement after indenture. It focuses on the life of a single individual, my grandfather, Dr. Bhawani Prasad Bhattacharya, to raise some open questions about whether there's value in thinking about later movement alongside earlier arrival, and that includes histories of indenture. Very little has been written about Indian migration to Guyana after indenture. Occasionally there are fragments, suggestions, or side glances in other works, as in Rahul Bhattacharya's depiction here of Indian nationals on their Indian national walks along the sea wall. In general, however, the narratives available portray Indian nationals as an isolated community, bounded and resistant to participation in wider Guyanese life. Local news reporting tends to agree with this, particularly when focusing on new Indian and Chinese business owners who undercut the local market. The presence of Indian national technical specialists is also associated with larger scale investment projects, and sometimes with fears of new kinds of global exploitation and extraction. In this talk, I hope to counteract two assumptions that come from the idea of Indian nationals as a bounded group. The first is to show how active participation in wider Guyanese social life could sit alongside the maintenance of more exclusive networks, and some practical mechanisms by which both of these were actively maintained. The second, and more work in progress hope, and this is what I hope people can take forward from here if it interests them, is to open the potential of stretching Indian arrival after indenture into a spectrum over time, rather than a single type of experience. Even during the indenture period, some individuals were making their way from India to Guyana under their own means. And still today, there are new movements like technical experts arriving to help revitalize Guyana's sugar production. Indenture obviously dominates the history of movement from India to Guyana, but other kinds of migration have occurred and are set to continue developing in the future. Understanding how these resonate with previous movements might help tell us more about what is going on today, but also what was specific to the indentured situation. So I'm going to start with a narrative overview of my grandfather's life. Most of this will be based around that just because of limitations through doing this in COVID-19. But then I'm going to dive into some aspects in a bit more detail. There are quite a lot of images, so bear with me. And if there's anything you want to return to at the end in the Q&A, then just let me know. So Bhawani Prasad Bhattacharya was born in Calcutta in 1911, when the system of indentured movement was still taking place. His family were high-caste Bengali who, though not wealthy, were able to send him first to a government-aided high school and then on to study medicine at the University of Calcutta. After graduating, he took on a number of positions at maternity hospitals, specializing in gynecology, before serving at the Indian Military Hospital in Calcutta during the Second World War. In 1948, and after seeing firsthand the partitioning of Bengal, Dr. Bhattacharya decided to look for opportunities abroad and moved to the UK to further his specialist training. From here, he then organized a temporary placement in the US, during which he visited clinics in Boston, Baltimore, Chicago, and Detroit, with the expressed aim to investigate leading work on cancers of the reproductive system and bring back best practice to help the suffering humanity of India, as he termed it in his application. In fact, Dr. Bhattacharya never returned to India. These trips abroad grew into a more permanent move to the UK, made possible by the Medical Practitioners Act of 1947, which allowed medical professionals from the Commonwealth to register for employment in UK hospitals. Taking this opportunity, he worked across a number of hospitals between 1950 and 57, but Despite multiple years of service, he eventually found barriers to his promotion and was frustrated in his hopes to apply for a consultant position. So again, he turned abroad. Having met my grandmother, Doris Whiteley, in the early 1950s, while she was working as a nurse in Bolton, they married in 1957 and moved through the remaining structures of the British Empire to arrive in what was then East Pakistan. This was the closest available consultancy position to Calcutta, where much of their family still lived. But political instability and widespread discontent made it a difficult environment, particularly with the birth of my mother in that first year of arrival. That same year, the Bhattacharya's decided to move on, hearing about an open position in British Guyana, which my grandmother still jokes they thought was Ghana until they stepped off the boat. On their way, the Bhattacharya's first stopped in Calcutta to introduce a young Joyashri, my mother, to her wider family and to conduct Anniprasan, the ceremonial first eating of solid food. They then caught the SS Arcadia on her return leg to England, before travelling up to Liverpool, boarding the SS Commuter to Trinidad, and finally on to British Guyana. Here, Dr. Bhattacharya became Guyana's first professionally trained gynecologist and took on a 4-year contract to modernise practice at Georgetown Public Hospital's maternity ward, living here at the hospital complex on East Street, so you can see in the picture. Things went well, with deaths in childbirth significantly decreasing over the 4-year period. And at the contract's end, the Bhattacharyas returned to England, where, to all intents and purposes, they planned to remain. Perhaps it was the cold winter, where my grandmother remembers the heating failing on Christmas Eve, or, as I'm inclined to believe, perhaps it was the unique opportunities experienced while in British Guyana to create something new, where Dr. Bhattacharya's position could enable a professional status and a high-class life, one very much akin to that of the exiting colonial elite. Either way, British Guyana drew the Bhattacharyas back, and in 1964 they returned to Georgetown, to this house at number 45 High Street. My grandfather established a private clinic alongside treatment of patients across Guyana's hospitals and free clinics in the interior of Amerindian communities. In the initial years, this was paid for by the government, who flew them out and paid for flights. Although eventually my grandmother, mother, and uncle would all find their way back to the UK, Dr. Bhattacharya remained living and working in Guyana until his death in 1996. In total, he was there almost 40 years, from before independence to the end of the 20th century. I want to start by focusing on that idea of a bounded Indian national community, but detailing a little bit more about what it might have actually meant. In Dr. Bhattacharya's case, it wasn't some overarching Indian national. It was very specifically a connectedness with other Bengali professionals, some who he met while studying Calcutta, but others who he built relationships with later in life. Photographs and letters reveal a network of relationships that supported his journeys to different countries. In every city he visited in the US, he was hosted by other Bengali professionals. The same was true in the UK, with some of this network visible here in a photo of a trip taken down to Brighton. This kind of networking continued in Guyana, with Bengali medical professionals hearing about opportunities there from existing contacts before taking the decision to migrate. In later years, Dr. Bhattacharya took an active role in helping new Indian arrivals get set up in Guyana, facilitating introductions with key local contacts and equipping each family with a copy of Guyana, A Nation on the Move, a booklet published by the Guyana Information Services. Bengali identity was also important in the home. Here, my mother and uncle are pictured during Bhaipota, a celebration which recognises the bond between brothers and sisters. Having grown up with older sisters himself, my grandfather was keen to impress its value upon his children. Celebrations like this were also a chance to strengthen intergenerational connections. This image was taken at the only time a member of Dr. Bhattacharya's family visited Guyana in 1973. It's a joint family celebration with his sister present alongside my mother and uncle. Even after my mother was sent to finish her A-level education in England, in response to the changing educational opportunities under Forbes-Burnham and my grandfather's wish for her to maintain access to Britain, she still exchanged Bhaipota gifts and blessings with my uncle from afar. A Bengali identity was also important in the maintenance of close-knit networks within Guyana. Multiple times a month, one of the Bengali families would host the others in a party that involved traditional food and dress. Dr. Bhattacharya often structured these parties around Bengali music, and this photo was taken at one of those music night parties. He was a keen singer and loved to perform the songs of Rabindranath Tagore. One aspect of this focus, this kind of traditional Bengali focus in the parties, was that they often ended up being quite strictly gendered, and men and women would be separated for large portions. Whether intentionally or not, this separation meant my grandmother often found herself excluded by the other women as the only non-Bengali present. I've definitely understated her presence in this paper, but her position on the edge of the Bengali community is essentially an understanding the much wider circle of friends and support in Guyana that the Bhattacharyas came to develop. Bengali networks were maintained outside of parties too, and outside of weekend trips away to picnic or swim at creeks together. One way in which a specifically Bengali aspect of these relationships was maintained was through the circulation of traditional foods. The wooden molds pictured here were brought by Dr. Bhattacharya from India and were used to make Bengali-style sweets to gift to other families. This wasn't something totally exclusionary, as it does seem that my grandfather wanted to share elements of this identity with a much wider audience. He actually submitted his recipe for Sandesh sweets to a cookbook produced by the Indian Cultural Centre's Women's Group, where it sat alongside recipes from across India and Guyanese contributors. Understanding how my grandfather thought about Bengali cultural heritage as something to be kept within a bounded community or to be shared widely is a puzzle I haven't solved. For instance, this picture shows his handwritten songbook with the songs of Tagore in Bengali script. As well as singing at Bengali music parties within the home, he also participated in much wider performances in Georgetown. On at least 2 occasions, he sang at the Gandhi Youth Centre to mark the birthday of Rabindranath Tagore, whose works have been performed in Guyana since at least the 1930s. Was this a sharing of culture to a keen audience of Guyanese descended from Indenture? In a 1997 article, Peter Manuel suggested that from the 1970s onward, there was a growing Indian cultural revival, and perhaps Indian nationals like my grandfather found a part in this, bringing expert knowledge and Bengali fluency to an already interested public. I'm not sure. At the same time as Indian cultural performances like this were taking place, other forms of cultural expression descended from Indenture were being limited under Burnham's PNC regime. This comes out a bit more clearly when thinking about Indian classical dance. During the 3-year placement of Kathak dance expert Pratap Pawar from India, Dr. Bhattacharya helped arrange performances in Georgetown. He enrolled my mum in Kathak dance classes, which were attended by Guyanese of Indian and African descent, as well as Indian nationals. Their dance troupe produced a number of public performances, including being present at state-sponsored events like Carifesta in 1972, an event which many Indo-Guyanese performers, or performers descended from Indenture, boycotted. Their troupe was even invited to perform at the Prime Minister's residence. More research is needed to identify the extent to which the cultural activities of Indian nationals may have played a role in supporting an officially sanctioned image of Indian heritage in Guyana at a time in which opportunities for Indo-Guyanese promotion were being limited. I don't mean to imply that Dr. Bhattacharya or his family were somehow naively involved in promoting a new kind of Guyanese national identity. Through the archives available, my grandfather seems genuinely committed to the future of the nation, in his own medical work and in his wider life. He was a keen attendee of cultural events and photographed many, including this one of Republic Day in 1973. The Bhattacharyas also loved and took part in every kind of event that happened in Georgetown, from Fagwa celebrations to flying kites at Easter on the sea wall. Their weekends were spent visiting creeks to swim, and many evenings took place at Georgetown cinemas, a hub of activity in the 60s and 70s. In the absence of family, they relied on close-knit networks of friends, not just from the Bengali professional community, but all kinds of residents in Georgetown. Their best friends were perhaps the Khans, known most for Mr. Khan's work in radio broadcasting, based out of Radio Demerara, which sat opposite the Bhattacharya's house on High Street. Particularly for my grandmother, who sometimes found herself excluded in Indian national parties, Mrs. Khan was a lifeline. It was for these kinds of friends and wide networks of acquaintances across Georgetown that the Bhattacharya's hosted much more inclusive gatherings. My grandfather was, by all accounts, a loud character, a natural host, and keen to help new people connect. He would regularly run into people in the days leading up to a party, invite them along, and numbers could quickly double what was first planned. Beyond this, he was a highly active member of the Georgetown Lions Club, and strongly involved in local charity projects throughout his life. How then to make sense of my grandfather's role in Guyana across these 40 years? The unusual and particular position afforded to him by his work provided access to all levels of Guyanese society. On the one end, there are photos of the Bhattacharyas taking tea at Government House, pictured here, before independence. In another family album, there's a snapshot of Forbes Burnham sitting with Dr. Bhattacharya's tennis partner, B.K. Prasad. My grandfather, through his work, had delivered Burnham's daughter and was subsequently invited to play tennis at his residence, which he did 2 or 3 times every week. At the other end of the spectrum, Dr. Bhattacharya treated individuals all across Guyana in his medical work and regularly waived any fee for those he couldn't afford. He and my grandmother would often spend Sunday lunch visiting rural families who had invited them in thanks. The relationship between his medical work and his commitment to Guyanese of all backgrounds, and actually to Guyana itself as a new nation, can perhaps be best seen in research he conducted on health consequences of multiple births among rural Indo-Guyanese families, a copy of which is shown here. And apologies for those who are archivists among us. I know it doesn't look particularly healthy. In this paper, he takes particular issue with the Vatican position against family planning. His closing comments are worth repeating in full, as to me they represent a much deeper feeling expressed throughout his own life. Only a few inherit happiness in life, but for the great masses of the people whose homes are not so good, whose schools are not so bright, and whose opportunities are so far from fair, happiness has to be erected at the sacrifice of tradition. I don't yet have a conclusion for how my grandfather's life fits with or against prior indentured movement. I hope that, as an audience keenly interested in histories of indenture, you perhaps have your own ideas of how to make sense of these fragments and the ways in which they might sit with other narratives of Indian arrival. That being said, there are some clear areas I think this narrative opens up for future exploration. This story begins with movement for opportunity through the structures of the British Empire. There is the separation from family, a deep reliance on personal networks and relationships, and eventually a celebration and commitment to a new kind of life made possible by this movement. But this is also a movement where the power and agency of indenture is reversed, an arrival into the space vacated by exiting colonial elites at the turn of independence, and a move to Guyana as an imported professional class. If presenting this history of my grandfather's done anything, I hope it is in showing that to understand Indian arrival after indenture and the possible resonances it might have, there is an awful lot more work still to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rhys. Can I ask Lizzy, Rhys, if you kindly leave your camera on and your mic on, and if I could ask Lizzy, if you wouldn't mind just kindly popping your camera and your mic on. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So I've got some questions for you. Can I start with this one just selfishly, because I thought it was quite interesting. Lizzy, what do you think we could learn from history and the issue of citizenship that you brought up with regard to the ongoing debates around the Windrush scandal and recent British plans for overseas immigration centres?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And yeah, I guess that's quite a hot topic at the moment. And I think there's so much to learn from, like the history of the British Empire and the impacts that that has on subjecthood and immigration and citizenship. But I guess the key point is that it is conditional, and that the official history tries to set like citizenship as something really concrete that has been around for a really long period of time, but British citizenship as we know it has only been around since 1981, the 1981 Act. And there was free movement, particularly to Britain, up until 1962. So from then onwards, when people started to exercise their free mobility to Britain, then immigration laws started to become legislated to prevent that. So I guess, yeah, I think it's really important that we learn that history in order to support people whose citizenship and status is being questioned. And as the Windrush is a really great example of how the state went too far. And I think the British population just that was too extreme in terms of the violences of immigration laws. So need to like not be too hung up on like this concept of citizenship and rightfulness. I think like while there is a really important history for the people of Windrush, if we just focus on them being citizens, then we kind of lose a lot of the violence that surrounds it, and then like we don't support lots of people who also need that support.
Thanks so much, Lizzy. And I'm having some messages. Not all are addressed to everyone. Some are just coming through to me just to thank you very much for your paper. I'm coming back to you with another question. Rhys, I've got a question here from Dabydeen, who's asked you to. He missed what you said about Burnham limiting Indo-Guyanese cultural events. So if you would be kind enough to revisit that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, yeah, so I think I didn't explain it very much because I didn't necessarily mean to say that Burnham's regime was actively reducing opportunities so much as the promotion of other kinds of things. I think the book to go for on this is Musical Life in Guyana, I think it's called, sort of a history of the cultural politics of music in Guyana during a very long period by Vibert Cambridge. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce the name, but and in that he has quite a lot in which he says about, particularly around sort of the 70s and things, the active promotion of particular kinds of music over others. And one of those things I remember is the institution of steel drum bands is a particular kind of like Afrocentric musical performance, and like the money pumped into supporting that across Guyana at the same time as not necessarily putting the same into music and cultural stuff descendants of Indenture. And I think, what I was trying to say in my presentation is that working from things like my mother's diaries or photographs, you see that there's elements of a return to kind of a classical Indian performance, which actually seems to involve a lot of people who are Indian nationals, not necessarily long-term residents descended from Indenture, whether it's Kathak dancing or, in the case of my grandfather, sort of the songs of Tagore, and a space given over to those sorts of events, but not necessarily to the sorts of music and performance that so many other writers have written about it as coming up through Indenture and the histories related to that, and sort of the cultural mixing as well that comes out of that. As I say, it's something where a lot more research needs to be done. I'm not a historian by trade, but I definitely am getting excited by the potential of it.
Can I ask you, Rhys, I'm going to marry these two questions together. One is from our colleague Rajrani Gobin in Mauritius. Does the Bhattacharya family still cherish Bao Sangeet, the folk music promoted by Tagore. And Judith Misrahi Barak, who's asked, says, thank you, Rhys. Could you give us your perspective on how you think caste travelled from India and inflected the family's experience, if at all, even indirectly?
Yeah, for sure. I think the music question is interesting. So my grandfather died when I was 1 year old. 2 weeks before his death, he took a flight from Guyana to the UK to meet me as a baby. But so, I mean, I don't know so much. And, you know, a lot of what he learned, he trained as a sort of first playing the flute and then learning to sing while in Calcutta. I don't think that was passed down to his children. Music was, my mum's a keen pianist. But the best insight I have into that is actually from, I mentioned earlier that my grandfather was good friends with Mr. Khan, sort of one of the broadcasters at Radio Demerara. And at one point he was invited on to do a sort of a Desert Islands disc, which we have sort of the record for, like with the written, what he said, and, you know, the crossings out and him editing what he was saying or wanted to give out. And in that you see, yes, there is this love for the music of Tagore, and there's this love for the folk music as well of Bengal, but there's also a love for, you know, Oklahoma and that kind of musical and songs he heard on the radio when he was doing his studies in Oxford, his further education studies. And he closes that segment by going back to Tagore and drawing on Tagore's philosophy that actually, you know, music, I think he has a point where he says, in the music of Tagore, you see all of life, like all of philosophy is expressed in his music. And that's about a shared individuality, a shared soul that goes across all people. And I generally think that my grandfather committed to that. He, to some extent, he's not necessarily, it's not an insight into what all Indian nationals experienced in this time, because he was driven very much by the philosophy of Tagore as well, which he took on personally, and the opportunities presented in Guyana, both to draw on at times, things like the connections enabled by caste, and that's to other sort of Bengali, when I say Bengali medical professionals, obviously that overlaps with high caste. So that is one of those ways in which you talk about caste without talking about caste, if you know what I mean. But at the same time, he made so many more friendships and so many other connections outside of that. Yeah, I hope that answers that a little bit.
Thanks so much. Another question for Lizzy here from Arlen. Lizzy, has Dominion and imperial immigration policy impacted on current British immigration policy? Did you find traces of?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, this research is part of my PhD research, which is basically trying to trace the colonial roots of the hostile environment, which are the current immigration policies. So this is one of the earlier chapters to do that, and I focused on the Pacific region in this presentation, but I mentioned the White Dominions very much shared legislation, and so Canada was one of the was a key in sort of exercising its independence through immigration and creating its own citizenship, which fractured again British subjecthood and really threw a challenge to the colonial office. And so in doing that, the 1948 legislation, in the UK or in Britain, was a direct response to that, to basically try and hold on to this idea of empire and London being the heart of empire, because Canada, Australia, New Zealand were exercising independence to be able to introduce their own immigration laws. And that was it didn't really do anything new, but it legislated the free movement of across the British Empire, and obviously subsequently there was then movement, particularly from the Caribbean, but all over the British Empire to the UK. And yeah, just generally most immigration law before that as well. There's the 1905 Act, which is basically it enshrines asylum, the right to asylum, for the first time, but that was explicitly to exclude aliens and non-British citizens, and that was again a response to immigration laws in the Americas, because Parliament felt that if there were restrictions in other countries, then people who couldn't get into those countries were coming to Britain, and they didn't really like the class of person who was then coming to Britain. So that was usually, the UK is quite late in implementing immigration laws, and it's usually as a response. Yeah.
Thank you, Lizzy. Thanks for that answer. I've got another question for you here, Rhys. How do these exiles and migrations give rise to different subnationalisms? And do you think these networks of affiliation away from their homelands create a new sense of community?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, again, it's hard for me to know. Like, one thing I really wanted to get across in this is that intense individuality. We can talk about movements of groups, we could talk about Indian nationals, we could talk about Bengali communities abroad, but at its core, there's also individuals who make connections through such diverse ways, you know, living opposite broadcasting house and then becoming friends with people involved in radio broadcasting because of that, you know, people you meet on the street. And those are genuinely important as well. But in terms of exile and movement and creation of networks abroad and reattaching to home, yeah, I think they do. But at the same time, in this experience, it's not necessarily something long lasting that then passes down intergenerationally. I can't speak for other ones, but you know, for the case of my grandfather, he was always attached to his Bengali identity. He was also deeply attached to his British identity because he grew up in Britain before, in India while it was still British India. He moved to British Guyana while it was still British Guyana. Eventually he switched and got a Guyanese passport, but you know, for him, it really was a movement through the British Empire as much as anything else. But for his children and for us growing up hearing stories, then the next generation on, it's much more about being in Guyana. That was what impacted the childhood of my mother, my uncle, I can't speak for quite so much, but my mother certainly. It's remembering, you know, that there is that a level of, okay, once a week we have this Bengali party, but there's all the rest of the week where you're just saturated in the colours and music and food and tastes of Guyana and being a child there. And I think especially when you're then feel like you're forced to move from there elsewhere, in this case, because of sort of the various kinds of limitations of opportunities or perceived limitations of opportunities came in under Burnham and the PNC. Lots of people, obviously, anyone who knows stuff about sort of the history of Guyana knows there was a mass exodus of people around that time. I think that is what led to the attachment to Guyana for my mother and maybe perhaps people of her generation, rather than casting back all the way. And I think it is to do with that forced element. When you're forced to go somewhere, this maybe speaks to the question again about exile compared to other kinds of movement. When you're forced to move, I do think that attachment has a very different meaning to where you choose to move and then use those networks in a much more proactive way. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks so much, Rhys. Lizzy, can I give you a question from Eric, who says, thank you very much for your presentation. You mentioned that the citizenship of the Indian migrants who moved out of India terminated. And he's asking, was this irretrievable? So did they, when they returned to India, did they once again become citizens? And did this also apply when they traveled to other parts of the British Empire, for example, Guyana?
Okay, thank you, Eric, for the question. Maybe I wasn't very clear that I didn't mean to say that the citizenship of Indian migrants was ceased when they moved out, because it was British subjecthood, which was the status, and that was across the empire. So it wasn't that there wasn't Indian citizenship to lose at that point, and a lot of people did return to India from after their indentured time period, and I think there were difficulties about integrating back into society when that did happen, but they had their status to be able to do so, and yeah, were required to. I think maybe the legislation I was referring to was that it defined what emigration was within the concept of indentureship. So it was the only time where free movement was legislated to be able to control it. So that's sort of what indentureship did. It created a subcategory or an exception within British subjecthood, which I guess I'm arguing later through sort of that was the start, and then the dominions through immigration laws kind of burst that fracturing open, with then being able to differentiate between British subjects through immigration laws.
That's lovely, thank you. So this has got to be our last question. Thank you so much, Lizzy. For Rhys, was there any society or organisation in Guyana in your grandfather's time to promote classical Indian traditions of music and dance or literature?
Yeah, so from what I know, I think the premier sort of institution regarding this would be the Indian Cultural Centre, just founded in the early 1970s, actually. So not right when he arrived, but then during the time he was there. And it's an offshoot of the High Commission of India in Guyana. So it's closely tied to India's presence there, like at a formal national kind of level. And if I'm right, it was founded following the visit of Indira Gandhi in the early 1970s, as part of a kind of one of these first times at which India starts to recognize that it has this network of other countries where it has connections to through histories of indenture, and actually maybe it, rather than previously to some extent, if people left, then for various reasons like loss of caste and other things, like there was those connections were severed to some extent, not completely. We know there was remigration and stuff and people returning, but to some extent India wasn't as interested. That kind of changes and a little bit, and partly that changes with this cultural outreach. In the 70s we start developing these Indian cultural centres abroad. Guyana, I think, was the first one in the Caribbean sort of region for an Indian cultural centre like this to be set up. And again, it ties back into this question of, to what extent were Indian nationals involved, because there's photos in our family kind of albums of the visit of, Mrs. Gandhi, and the presentation of children to her in traditional dress. And half those children are children of Indian national families, not children of indentured descendants, despite the fact that Indian national families are such a small proportion. Like we're talking, maybe hundreds of people rather than hundreds of thousands of people. So I think there's really a lot to explore there in terms of, although it's such a small movement, what are some of the ramifications of how it played out? Yeah.
Thank you so much to Rhys and Lizzy for those fascinating papers, and for coming. I have tremendous admiration for early career researchers who've managed to pull together such excellent work during the pandemic. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you as well for having us.
Thanks.
So can I let all the audience know we have a change to our planned programme, because our friend and colleague Daryl Baksh has been pulled away by an emergency, and we all obviously wish Daryl well, and we will be in touch with him when waters calm at his end, just to ask him to come back and do a talk for us another time. We'll have a lunchtime session with him. But what we would love to do before we go to, so we're going to go to our break as planned, but what we'd love to do is offer you kind of an alternative. So I have kind of an extract from my chapter for a forthcoming publication I've edited with Dabydeen. So the book is called The Other Windrush, and it's a collection of writing from Chinese and Indian descendants of Indenture, who were also part of the UK's Windrush generation. And I hope, it's going to take us to the break, and I hope that I can share, you'll be able to see while I'm reading, my tech support will tell me if you can't, a cover of the book. Let's have a go. There we go. So can my tech support just confirm for me that you can see?
Yep, it's there. Maria, you're on the side, so do you want to be seen?
No, so let me turn myself, shall I turn myself off?
Give that a go and see if that
Is it
works.
just a small?
Yeah, you're just in the corner.
That's cool.
Okay.
I can be a small picture in the corner. Okay, so Pluto have also asked us to share with you that they are going to, so we just confirmed with them, it's because this book is actually being released until June the 20th. So I just asked their permission to read this extract today when Daryl contacted me, and they've given us a code, which my super colleague Eve, who I'm calling tech support, is Eve, is going to type into the chat. And if you put this code into Pluto's website, it will give you 30% off the book today. So this is an extract from The Other Windrush, Legacies of Indenture in Britain's Caribbean Empire. And I dedicate it with love to my parents. It sounds like I'm a little bit hard on them, but I mean, I adore them. So I hope it doesn't come across that way. Everything of us. Since my mother died, I've been traveling for 4 hours, 1 day a week, out of London and back again. I had become aware that my dad was, as he put it, fading away, unable to handle his paperwork, inclined to forget what needed to be done, and housebound as the result of problems balancing. On the last occasion he went to the city centre, he ambulated so precariously that the police, on seeing him, arranged for 2 paramedics to bring him home. Even with the knowledge that he is approaching his 82nd year, the idea of my dad walking unsteadily is something I am still getting accustomed to. Since the early 80s, he had worked in London's best hotels as a silver service waiter. The weight of the trays he carried so easily, in and out of ballrooms, in order to feed his 5 children, would have been immense to anyone else. But this job that gave him no time to think was what he most wanted. To be so tired that he could automatically shut down any voice that told him that he had failed, that he couldn't have travelled thousands of miles across a frigid ocean to an ice-cold bedsit, to live amongst a lukewarm people, and to become a waiter. He would come home late at night, quietly removing his shoes at the entrance to the house, as he must have done in Guyana as a boy. His bow tie would be untied, but still around his neck, his waistcoat still done up. He would remove the tools of his trade from his pockets, bottle opener, cigar, pen. He would have been aware each night he came home that he had not in any sense lived up to his father's dreams for him. His father, my grandfather, was the last of 10 children of an indentured labourer named Kaladeen, who arrived in British Guyana in 1881. Born in 1915, he was named Bihari, and he was the only one of his siblings to avoid a working life on the plantation. Bihari was apprenticed to another Indian Guyanese, from whom he learnt the skill of tailoring, eventually opening his own shop in Georgetown. He was a forward-thinking man who educated his daughters as well as his sons, and who wanted more for his children. It was Bihari who anglicised our family name from Kaladeen to Kaladeen, keen that we should not be associated with the colonially acquired stain of Kali worship, and that Indianness, while important to him, should not be the thing that held his children back. I understand that my grandfather was loved unreservedly by his children and respected in his community. On a monthly basis, he would make his home a dharamsala by feeding those who were needy in the community. In the heat of the Indian and African race riots of the 60s, Bihari moved his family to Canada, where 2 of my father's siblings had already settled. He accepted this new world and its colour bar without complaint. He took work as a doorman at the Hotel Fairmont and set to picking up the pieces of his life as the shepherd of the family. I have never met anyone who said anything about my grandfather, and his reputation as a good and kind man was sealed by his early death at 56 of an aneurysm. My father's brothers and sisters were crushed by this loss, which was made greater by the knowledge that they had not lived up to his educational expectations for them. But it was my dad, the second eldest, who left not just Guyana, but his entire family, who felt the death less and the sense of having disappointed him more. In the weeks after my mother died, my father spoke to me about his daily journey from his house to Peters Hall Primary School, grudgingly created by the colonial planters to educate the children on the plantation of the same name. Bihari had gone to the same school as my father as a boy, and he had had the same teacher. This teacher, Teacher Solomon, would look at my dad fixedly at least once a week, and with the firm conviction that the intellectual apple had fallen far from the tree, she would say to him, wagging her finger and shaking her head, "Boy, you're nothing like your father." In many of our conversations, we would return to this walk to school and to the people and the events of this time. And it was in the telling and retelling of these stories that he seemed sometimes to finally understand that my mother, who he had asked for intermittently since her death, was not coming back. Things had been bad between my parents in the months before my mother died. In the hospital, she refused to see him. There was nothing irregular in this. In over 55 years of marriage, they had never managed to find a way to live together without conflict. In the weeks after the ambulance brought him home, he stopped going out. The little he did to help out in the house dwindled to nothing, and she became responsible for every single meal, every washed plate, and every hoovered carpet. He retreated into himself, and she would call me angry, resentful, hinting darkly that she had concerns about her own health. Eventually, they stopped talking to each other, a pattern that they had established during my childhood, when one furious bust-up could lead to years of silence. For the majority of my school years, they did not talk at all, but my older brothers remember a time when things were different, when they would occasionally communicate without friction, but they also remember having to physically come between them. And if I try, I too remember these moments. I can see the pieces of her radio scattered on a carpet because he had smashed it in that way he had of letting her know that he was the boss and she was nothing. My parents were the sort of people who should have been very particular about who they married and how many children they had. My mother, a fair-haired, blue-eyed Galician from the north of Spain, should have settled for someone as white and glacial as herself. Then she would not have spent the remaining decades. Oh, have I still got you?
We can still hear you, Maria.
You can still hear me. Okay, let me carry on. I think I've lost the screen. I've lost the book screen, but let me just carry on. Okay, sorry everyone. I'm just going to go back slightly. Okay. Then she would not have spent the remaining decades of her life blaming her husband's culture and her children's mixedness for the mess of her life. And my father should definitely not have had 5 children. He hated noise and he hated disorder. And in that singular Caribbean way, he believed that discipline was something that could be whacked into a child. Perhaps he should have married a woman light-hearted enough not to always take him literally, who understood the Guyanese need to perform, that what we say is not necessarily true, that sometimes it's more about how it sounds, that the words and their meanings can have separate lives. But my mother was born in the Spanish Civil War and grew up in a dictatorship. She did not come from a time or place where hearts could afford to be light. There had been signs before, but they are never really signs before, are they? In truth, they become what we have decided to see after the fact. It was difficult to tell if his memory had deteriorated after his first stroke. He had always been absent-minded. This absent-mindedness had cost her hours of worry when they first married. My mother did not work outside the home, and my father assumed total financial responsibility for the family. She developed a habit of going through the papers on his desk to check that bills were paid. Each time she was pregnant, she lived in fear that he would one day walk out of a shop and forget to pay for something. She need not have worried. He knew his limitations and never walked into a large shop without picking up a basket, knowing his capacity, even when young, to get lost in his own head. When they were courting, my dad confided in my mum that he had gone out on a date with a girl and left her in the middle of London to go home, completely forgetting that he had been with her until he reached his bedsit. My mum was born in the same region of Spain as Maria Pita, the spear-carrying vanquisher of the English invaders. She would have stared him straight into an understanding that he would never forget her. In the years following his first stroke, she would momentarily be preoccupied about him. He gets very confused, she would say. But she didn't take it further and I didn't press her. I wondered if this confusion was just his way of shutting her down. 3 months after she died, I arrived at the house and began to make coffee. My back was to him, so he didn't see my face when he asked me where Mummy was. You don't remember? There was a long pause. I remember, he said, eyeing me as though I didn't have all the facts, but I can hear her sometimes moving around up there. And with his head, he gestured to the room above us that had always been hers. There was a sense of triumph in his voice, like when you're right, but you don't want to gloat. The next morning, I called the doctor, and 2 days later, I received a call back. My father had been diagnosed with dementia 4.5 years ago. Was I sure he hadn't told anyone? What did he do? I asked myself. Did he walk out of the clinic and decide not to tell anyone? Did he walk out of the clinic and forget his diagnosis? Or did he walk out and decide that he did not accept the diagnosis? I do remember that a couple of decades earlier, he had told me with real fear in his eyes that his grandmother had something like dementia before she died. This woman, Buchia, had come to Guyana as a little girl with her mother in 1876 and eventually became Kaladeen's wife. Whatever he decided that day, my mum died thinking that my dad had retreated into himself and ignored her own declining health. She never told him about the mass that she must have known was growing inside her. And by the time she went to the doctor, her undiagnosed cancer had metastasized. Within 2 weeks of arriving at the hospital, she was dead. Right up until the last moment, she had refused to see him. And so the marriage ended as it had endured, on the back of misunderstandings and nurtured grudges. Inevitably, we have become time travelers in our weekly conversations. We talk a lot about that journey to his primary school in Guyana, along the road that ran past the cane field. We talk about how he used to follow the road back home at lunchtime and see his uncles, Kaladeen's sons, and employees of the plantation peacefully engaged in their lunch. He told me that he hadn't wanted to disturb them as they looked so grateful for their break. Why? What would they have said? Oh, you know, come here, boy. He says this in a gruff, affectionate way that I recognize immediately as the way he speaks to his grandsons. But of course, my father is getting worse. His mind will not miraculously fuse itself back together, and he will lose more of his memories. One day, quite recently, I told him that I was sorry that he never had an opportunity to share conversations like this with his own father. You were so young when you lost him, I said. My dad's not dead, he said, shaking his head, looking at me surprised. 2 weeks later, he called me to ask what time his father was coming home from work. And when I tried to find out more, I understood that in his mind, the day before, his father, my mother and I had all been in the house with him. But now he was alone and he didn't understand why. Well, this is how I understand what is happening to him. Time is not linear and he sees everything of himself and his past together. In this way, nobody is dead, and it's possible that he can be sitting in the room with his grandson, wondering when his own father will get back from work. Each week, as we travel along the road to Peters Hall Primary School, it feels as though we have moved a little further back in time, as though we are heading back to the beginning of that first day that he stepped out of the door to head off to school. My father has never spent a night in hospital, and one of the nurses who visits him at home told me that this naturally makes him a terrible patient. He is unused to being unwell and has never taken medicine. Once he was very seriously ill, but he doesn't remember this. When he was no more than a toddler, he had what would probably now be diagnosed as bronchiolitis. I know this because my uncle, my father's older brother, told me that he remembered their maternal grandfather a striking looking South Indian man who spoke Tamil, coming to the house and asking his daughter, my grandmother, to let him take care of him. He took my dad away and returned him days later when he had recovered. I love this story because it encapsulated the wonder of extended family that I had never known in London. As a child, my father grew up with all but one of his grandparents. Only Kaladeen had died before he was born. I imagine this man, that family law has it, travelled to Guyana independently of the indenture system, handsome, dark-skinned and grey-haired. I imagine him striding off down the road with my dad in his arms and his daughter looking on, safe in the knowledge that he could make everything right. In the coming months, my father will forget many more things, but I hope that some fragment of this story about his grandfather will remain. The story of a man who loved his daughter, a daughter who trusted her father, and a child held secure and certain in the land of his birth, peaceful and unaware of all that he would one day leave behind.
Yes, I think it's time to begin. I'd like to thank all of you for attending. It's so lovely to see the early career scholars at the forefront of our conference. And it's symbolic of the way that the Ameena Gafoor Institute wishes to proceed by giving a platform to early career scholars. And I hope that the third-year PhDs, the last-year PhD students will consider writing articles and submitting them to the Journal of Indentureship, which Maria and I and others are running. Because when you apply for work, there's a section that says publications, and if it's blank, you're in trouble. Anyway, I'd like to thank Maria Kaladeen. Before I introduce Nalini, let me thank a few people very briefly. Maria Kaladeen, enormous energy. That's why I call her Hurricane Maria. Eve Canram, who organizes the website and the IT. Arlene and Dan Harris, who do all our filming and oral history projects. Arlene is a veteran television producer. He's made about over 100 films, for documentary films for the BBC, for Channel 4, for Discovery Channel, and so on. We're really delighted to have him on board. To Lynn Macedo, who has created for the website the largest bibliography on indentureship anywhere in the world. Thousands of articles and books listed. If you want to know anything about Fiji, Mauritius, and so on, South Africa, the Caribbean, just check the website and the bibliography. Obviously, there are things missing, and people are writing in all the time to say, please list this book. And finally, my colleague, Dr. Roger van Zwannenberg, who's chair of the Pluto Educational Trust and co-founder of the Ameena Gafoor Institute, who is, just to put it in one line, a reservoir of wisdom and inspiration. Ameena Gafoor was hoping to attend the conference and to say a few words, but she's under the weather at the moment. So she sent a short message, which I will read out. As you know, Ameena Gafoor is the founder of the Ameena Gafoor Institute, and she's one of Guyana's leading philanthropists. She's also a scholar. She's the editor of the Arts Journal, which she's been doing for many, many years now. She's written a book on Roy Heath, the celebrated Caribbean novelist, published a bibliography on Indo-Guyanese writing from the 19th century onwards, about to publish what she calls a fictional autobiography. And this is her message. She says, I am delighted that the work of the Institute is making such promising progress. It inaugurated a seminar series in March by way of a talk by Cal Horapoli, who theorized indentureship in terms of coolitude. Its international conference today will enrich its work. I send warmest greetings to all the speakers, all the participants, all the organizers. Thank you, Ameena. So let me now introduce my friend Nalini Mohabir, Dr. Nalini Mohabir, who is Assistant Professor of Postcolonial Geography at Concordia University in Montreal. Her work focuses on the Caribbean diaspora and indentureship. A dozen and more articles have been published in a variety of journals, like All Acts and the Caribbean Review of Gender Studies. And she wrote the very best article I've ever read, ever, on the last boat to return to India, carrying former indentured laborers. That boat left in 1955. And that was the subject of a doctoral dissertation at the University of Leeds. Nalini, over to you.
Thank you so much, David. And it's just so lovely to see you and Maria, and reminds me of my time in the UK, which I do miss. First and foremost, I want to say a huge thanks to Ameena Gafoor and to yourself, David, and to Maria for your commitments to create the infrastructure that we so need for the field of indentureship studies. Really grateful for all the energy and time that you've put into curating this conference today. I'm also very happy to be with you on this epic and enigmatic day of arrival, where we mark not only the past, but the continuing struggle of arrival and the transformations of arriving anew. I'm just gonna share my screen with you. Okay, great. So my talk, entitled Benevolent Masters and Indentured Laborers, The Politics of Recognizing Humanity, explores the connections between white colonial officials who attempted to live up to humanitarian ideals and indentured workers who tried to give their testimonies on ill or unfair treatment, as well as the personal legacies that we inherit as descendants of indentured laborers. So just a brief history, which I know I don't really need to do for anyone here, but still. Indentureship is an under-examined site to explore the currency of whiteness in 19th century sugar colonies. For one, the beginning of indentureship is entwined with the end of slavery. During its time, indentureship was held as exemplary of the enlightened conditions of free and fair labor following the abolition of slavery, even though the logics of white plantocracy still governed Caribbean colonies. As Amar Wahab has detailed in a wonderful article from 2003, which later becomes the seed for his book, Disciplining Coolies, the stereotypes of East Indians relative to Africans found in the Caribbean travels of authors such as Charles Kingsley and Anthony Trollope pitted these groups against each other. And we can see this in the discourse replicated locally as well. And I'm very indebted to a friend that I have on Twitter that I have not yet met in person, Julianne Lee, who's sent me some of the archives that I'm using today. So this is a short story that appears in the Jamaican Gleaner in 1896. And in this story, we can see it's about a white police officer who dresses up in a turban disguised as a coolie to arrest an African Obia man for murder. So obfuscations and tensions served the need of white planters who sought to stabilize white supremacist colonial rule following emancipation. Plantation society, economic structures, governance, and discourse perpetuated notions of white as civilized and rational over Black or non-white individuals. This remained deeply entrenched across the 19th and 20th century. What shifted in the post-emancipation period, however, as David Scott, Lisa Lowe, and others point out, was an emphasis on individual freedom and rights embedded in liberal discourses of moral progress and development. Indentureship was a product of these investments in progress, conceived as a transitional system of contractual labor, incentivized by wages and controlled by legal tools, not whips. It is precisely because indentureship as an object of study is this in-between system between slavery and free-waged labor that it has eluded attempts to define it, or it has manifested contradictory definitions, either as a new system of slavery on one hand, or migrant agrarian labor coinciding with European free trade in Asia that we might understand as the Opium Wars. Today, I'm interested in revisiting a relationship to sympathetic white colonial officials and human rights observers who first exposed the abuse of indentured laborers on British Guyanese plantations at personal risk of their reputation among their white peers, although needless to say, this did not make them race traitors in that sense of abolishing their own whiteness. These historical figures included Magistrate and Superintendent of Rivers and Creeks, William Defoe, Chief Justice Beaumont, and Immigration Agent General James Crosby. Their actions led to the very well-known Royal Commission of Inquiry into the Treatment of Immigrants, and I know some of you have studied this document in great detail. This commission took place in 1870. And I first heard about it through my grandfather. This is my grandfather on the left here. Obviously in London in sometime in the 1960s. So my grandfather, Chabilal Ramcharan, told me, quote, individuals like Magistrate Defoe and James Crosby, the Immigration Agent General, fought for the people. Crosby represented the people. The plantation owners did not like him. Yes, he was a popular Englishman. These are the names of individuals who helped the indentured laborers. They helped bring an end to the indenture system. We must remember them. For their willingness to challenge oppressive practices on the plantation, these colonial officials became saviors within the narration of indenture history. Since upholding liberal ideals of freedom and fairness was the particular domain of the civilized colonizer, I wish to revisit the 1870 Commission of Inquiry into the Treatment of Immigrants to offer a close rereading of some snippets of testimony to examine not only the ways in which humanitarian-minded white officials carried out their responsibilities, but also to explore the presence of coolies speaking to or within colonial white power structures. I then link these fragments to the stories I have inherited from my grandfather to make a small intervention into whiteness studies, which I think has neglected indentureship as a site of study. Making visible the ways in which whiteness operates as a societal norm, where lives that depart from that norm are either diminished or deviant, is vital to dismantling systems of racism that we've inherited from the colonial past. And even acts of allyship require scrutiny. Take, for example, the 2007 British commemoration of the bicentenary of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, which took place the year that I started my PhD as well. So in 2007, many educational, cultural, and media organizations narrated the sole efforts of Enlightenment-influenced British abolitionists towards ending the slave trade without any mention of, for example, labor systems that followed. Just as an aside, I visited the Tate that year and asked if they had any memorabilia around this important bicentenary. And they had issued a booklet. And the booklet addressed the question of whether their benefactor, Henry Tate, was involved in the slave trade. And the answer given in the booklet was that Sir Henry Tate was not born until 1819, and he did not become involved in the grocery business until about 1839, after the abolition of the slave trade. Now, I'm sure many of you know that Tate and Lyle was the dominant sugar interest in Trinidad, and they owned almost all the land in the cane belt, where mostly East Indians, the descendants of indentured laborers, well, indentured laborers and their descendants lived. And furthermore, and more importantly, the actions of enslaved Africans who organized military campaigns against their oppressors were also omitted from the mentions that I had heard around the bicentenary on mainstream media. Additionally, there was a refusal to seriously engage with the ongoing demands for reparations from Caribbean countries. If these demands were acknowledged at all, they were countered by a distancing of the past from present culpability and attempted to redirect attention to the white moral goodness of the abolitionists. From the perspective of the Caribbean, however, the relationship between Europe and the Caribbean cannot be told so easily. In the present day, Shirley Tate points out that whiteness in the Caribbean is often understood through an expatriate or local white identity with ties to the metropole, which still allows continuing mobilities and relations back and forth with the former imperial centers of power that are not as easily available to other populations in the Caribbean. Historically speaking, even for white subjects that stood outside of the plantocracy, such as missionaries, Catherine Hall argues that white humanitarian identities were still dependent on the notion of white personhood as fully human in relation to the perceived status of African Caribbean subjects specifically, who were thought to require protection and guidance. And in fact, David Lambert argues that it is in the slave societies of the Caribbean where the full meaning of whiteness is most fleshed out, even when not readily apparent to those of European identity. To me, one of the most powerful encapsulations of whiteness within the context of a Caribbean plantation society emerges the year before Trinidad and Tobago's independence from Britain, when Eric Williams gave his famous speech, Massa de Den. As he states, Massa's long economic domination of the West Indies reduced the population of the West Indies, whether slave, contract, or free, to the drudgery of the simplest and most unedifying operations. He developed the necessary philosophical rationalization of this barbarous system. It was that the workers, both African and Indian, were inferior beings, unfit for self-government, unequal to their superior masters, permanently destined to a status of perpetual subordination, unable ever to achieve equality with Massa. Ahuja outlines that the system of indentureship relied on Massa, or more precisely, master and servant law, which was used to govern colonial work relations until the late 19th century. Under indenture, the relationship between servant and master was contractual. Any breach was a criminal offense, punished by a socially and politically biased judiciary who took the side of the planter. Contract law was used to define, quote, relationships between formally unequal parties, unquote, and its bureaucratic language was used to mask the contradictory forces of being both free and unfree. Hence, indentureship was shaped by prior colonial practices, which saw the survival of figures such as Massa, Bakra, and Overseer, despite the transformational moment of emancipation. Julieta Singh's Unthinking Mastery seeks to think through forms of mastery, not in forms of blunt domination, but rather a mastery that appears in discursive complicity at the same time with attempts at its undoing. Of particular interest to me is her chapter on the complicated humanitarian characters in the work of J.M. Coetzee and Mahasweta Devi. Singh writes, Despite the fact that humanitarian characters desire deeply to act in ethical ways, these narratives emphasize the complicity of humanitarian actors with the systems they oppose. This leads me to the Commission of Inquiry and the historical figures in it, as told to me by my grandfather. I'm interested in what happens when we put these two very different sources together, one archival, one familial, and what it may offer us regarding humanitarian benevolence entangled in our own investments of mastery. As Singh notes, humanitarian efforts founded on unequal power relations from colonial times into the present rely on tactics of dehumanization. She proposes an ethics of vulnerability that depends on a, quote, intimate awareness of relations of dependency, unquote, and finding ways to be together that move beyond mastery in the sense of its inherited liberal rationales and attempts to find another route to access being fully human. I'm drawn to Singh's framework due to my own family history and personal experiences. In the mid-20th century, my Aja worked for the Immigration Office in colonial British Guyana as an interpreter clerk. As he would proudly tell me, he was a Crosby Babu. Babu is a title of respect, and Crosby Babu was the call name of all those who worked in the Immigration Office, following Immigration Agent General James Crosby, who held the position from 1858 to 1880. Crosby's role was to protect immigrants, that is, indentured laborers. It's a role that Twomey refers to as one of the least studied aspects of colonial protection policy. Within colonial infrastructure, the immigrant protectorate role has parallels. Prior to emancipation, the protector of slaves was established in 1824 as part of an ameliorative effort to protect the enslaved from the worst brutalities. Similarly, abolitionist Thomas Buxton set up the Australian Aborigines Protection Society in 1837, and the East Indian Company established a Protector of Immigrants Office in India in 1842 to ease concerns over indentured emigration to Mauritius. These benevolently intentioned oversights depended on colonial white men assuming the role of paternal protector within bureaucratic structures that furthered violence and dispossession. In his role of protector, Crosby visited far-flung sugar estates up and down the Atlantic coast to investigate the complaints of indentured laborers. This was the infrastructure of 19th century humanitarianism, which underscored paternal relationships of colonial authority. Immigration Agent General Crosby, Chief Justice Beaumont, and Magistrate Deveux embraced their roles of protection by attempting to bring planters to accountability in British Guyana and to provide justice for indentured laborers. From the beginning of indentureship in the Caribbean, increasingly restrictive conditions were imposed on the indentured laborers. And by the 1860s, labor and vagrancy laws thoroughly bounded indentured laborers to the sugar estates in Guyana. As Mangru documents, past laws barred indentured laborers from reaching the Immigration Office. And I've been told that this is where the Immigration Office was located in Georgetown. And if anyone can confirm or has another source, please do let me know. So the Immigration Office was located in the capital, so at a distance from the sugar plantations. So to lodge a complaint, indentured workers would have to travel to the capital. And were often prevented from doing so. And their petitions often failed. As Candy points out, over 32,000 indentured laborers were charged, mostly for not completing their daily tasks between 1865 and 1870, so the 5 years prior to the commission. Protests on the sugar estates, referred to as riots in the colonial archives, broke out regularly in British Guyana. from the latter half of the 19th century till the end of the indentureship system. In 1869, riots occurred across 5 plantations, and armed police and military were called to Plantation Leonora. Following these protests, Deveux wrote a scathing 14-page letter to the Colonial Office describing systemic abuses against the indentured laborers, such as forced entry into their homes to turn them out to work, meager rations, insufficient drinking water, a lack of medical care, and, quote, premature and penniless deaths, unquote. The letter was referred to by the Times newspaper as, quote, the severest indictment of public officers since William Hastings, the governor of Bengal, was impeached, unquote. The letter also detailed the lack of independence afforded to magistrates, medical officers, and immigration agents, who were all under the controlling influence of planters and therefore more effective at persecuting rather than protecting the rights of indentures. As a result of his letter, a Royal Commission of Inquiry was established in 1870, which, as Maria has pointed out, provides the roots of cross-cultural conception of Guyanese working peoples, as it documented the entangled lives of Portuguese, Chinese, African, and Indian Guyanese laborers. The Commissioner's report was published in 1871. And in the same year, Beaumont also published The New Slavery, an account of Indian and Chinese immigrants in British Guyana, which highlighted that planters were only one generation removed from the role of slave masters. He writes, but they are none the less the instruments and even the actors in a most cruel tyranny because they are blind to its true character. The same worthy persons or their parents were the instruments and actors too in the old crime of slavery, stone blind to its disgrace and cruelties. Despite these efforts, it's perhaps Crosby, out of these 3 men, that held a special place in the imagination, perhaps due to his office being the first line of contact to the justice system. As A.R.F. Weber has described, this is Crosby's legacy, quote, officially, the department charged with the welfare of the immigrants is the Immigration Department. The Immigration Agent General and his outlying representatives are immigration agents, but through the length and breadth of the land, the whole is grouped under the generic title of Crosby. The head of all is the big Crosby, and his agents, little Crosbys. And wherefore? It is because at one time in the long ago, there lived an immigration agent general who was a tower of strength and righteousness to the immigrants, and his name was Crosby. A veritable protector of immigrants was he. Interred in some forgotten corner of a village churchyard, his virtues uncarved in stone and untold in monumental marble, his memory is carried as a living factor in the hearts of the people. So emblematic was Crosby with the protection of indentured laborers that the Immigration Office continued to be known as the Crosby Office well into the mid-20th century. This personified naming of a government office indicates the salience not only of protection, but also a sense of vulnerability or the need for protection, shared in collective memories, passed down through generations. The pride that Mayaja felt in his privileged role as a Crosby Babu, it's found in another statement that he told me. So, quote, in India, when someone wants to indicate respect, they say Babuji, which means great man. As Crosby was a famous man who fought for the rights of immigrants, the Immigration Office was known as the Crosby Office, and we were all Crosby Babu. This was his tribute to an exceptional figure. Yet, as Walter Rodney stated, complicit within these ideas was a childlike trust in the Immigration Office. So I now want to turn to the commission itself. And as Radhika Mangia has pointed out, the mode of official inquiry was perhaps one of the most significant methods for a production of truth in relation to the management of indentured laborers. Mongia's approach to inquiries, influenced by Foucault, is interested in dislodging truth as unrelated to the systems of power it's embedded in. As Mongia states, despite numerous inquiries into the condition of indentured laborers, the effect of any inquiry, quote, was the same, a continuation of the system, unquote, even though well-intentioned anxieties around the question of free or unfree labor never ceased. And we see this dynamic captured in Mahadai Das's poem, They Came in Ships, which was included quite prominently in David Dabydeen's and Brinsley Samaru's seminal creative and historical collection, India and the Caribbean. And I want to emphasize the bringing together of the creative and the historical in this text. In addition to this, well, sorry, maybe we should take a moment and read this poem. And so in these lines, she says, "And Devu cried, I wrote the queen a letter, for the whimpering of the coolies in their lodges would not let me rest. Beaumont, had the law been in my hands, and the cry of the coolies echoed around the land, they came in droves at the door of his office, beseeching him to ease the yoke of their burden. And Crosby struck in rage against the planters. In vain, he was stripped naked of his rights, and the cry of the coolies continued. The commissioners came, capital spectacles with British frames, consulting managers about the cost of immigration. They forgot their purpose. They forgot the purpose of their coming." And while this is obviously written, included in the book, I can also imagine that it echoed in the capacious space of bottom houses in Guyana. Das's poem emphasizes the economic lens of the commissioner's investigation into capital spectacles in British frames, which we also see in the inquiry through these kinds of documents that outline the benefits to quote coolies of indentureship. So here we have a memorandum of earnings from Plantation Albion, where my great-great-grandparents were indentured. We have in Appendix F, the financial statistics of how much the colony is contributing to the system of immigration. Again, great details of the annual expenses of the systems, all contained in these ledger sheets. So as I look at these documents, a concern arises for me that involves the question of how to move between these type of official documents and the personal knowledge gifted to me by my grandfather, and how to connect these documents of the state and the person. And I'll come back to this. But now I'll turn to Barrister John Edward Jenkins, who was sent by the Anti-Slavery Society to Guyana to observe the inquiry proceedings. And he wrote about this in The Coolie, His Rights and Wrongs, note the ambivalence in the title, made widely accessible through the efforts of David Dabydeen and the Caribbean Press. So it's available online. And as Dabydeen has written, Jenkins was not interested in condemning the system of indenture, but rather in reforming it. In Jenkins' travels to collect complaints and suggest questions for the investigation, he came across 300 Indians on strike, trying to reach Magistrate Devu, and he records a fragment of their conversation. "Oh, Massa, please, Massa, help Coolie. Manahi too bad, Massa starve 'em, beat 'em, chuck 'em. Massa stop 'em, wagey, take 'em wife. Coolie live too bad, Massa, too hard work, too little money, too little food." Here we have the voice of the coolie begging to be heard, but under conditions conditions which still require a subordination of one's humanity to the figure of massa, the white figure, which goes without saying. It is a social calculation necessary within a white plantation society where one could give evidence and be taken, where who could give evidence and be taken at their word, as Ogden points out, gets to the crux of the question of who is human or fully human, who might be viewed as less than human, with character flaws, with damaging and devastating character flaws, such as being sly, prone to malingering, irrational, easily excitable, or overly passionate, in other words, not objective. The legitimacy of this statement by the coolie, then, depends on recognition by the white barrister who has just arrived in the colony. Jenkins himself knows this as he tells the readers that he assesses the situation and then is satisfied that the coolie's lack of confidence in the administration of justice is warranted, even though the testimonial is spoken in, quote, a strange lingo that they call English, unquote. In another instance, a Chinese laborer reports a lack of food. Through an interpreter, the laborer tells Jenkins that many of his friends hung themselves because they were starving. And this woodcut, which I'm sure is familiar to all of you, appears at the beginning of Jenkins' text. And here we see the planter enjoying the fruits of civilized labor, which I borrow from Amar Wahab, and drawing blood from the indentured laborers. And it's suggestive of Jenkins' reference to indentured laborers as a mere skeleton of life. So the inclusion here of the images suggests that he's not inattentive to the maga, or the bony and hungry looking body, as another form of testimonial. In the commissioner's report, we have two indentured laborers on plantation Joanna Cecilia, Ramchum and Ramtohal. Quote, both admitted starvation from laziness, unquote. On plantation Zilat, Kuru commits suicide after not being paid for 3 weeks. On plantation Windsor Forest, bread is withheld. At plantation Cullen, there was no water. On plantation Good Success, immigration agent Crosby submits that he is, quote, inclined to believe, unquote, the statements of indentured immigrants being beaten. Again, courtesy of Julianne Lee, 5 years after the commissioner's report in 1871, she finds this article in the Gleaner, which mentions, quote, one Bawani, a coolie, of course, unquote, engaged in an act of cannibalism. That is, quote, disinterring the dead body of another coolie man and eating part of it, unquote. Here, the racially differentiated other, a coolie, of course, is punished for this crime by hard labor. Labor as moral punishment for the incomprehensible. And this announcement is followed by another, which tells us that a new supply of Indian labor will soon be shipped, and it's available for plantation owners that wish to extend their borders. Regardless of horrors presented, indentureship as stage is primarily a benign system, benefiting economic rationalities. Looking closely at the evidence in the Commission of Inquiry, at the fragments visible and present, not absent in the text, can help us understand how the plantation has evolved or continued in the post-emancipation manifestations of the sugar estate. Yet, what is the meaning of these fleeting fragments in the archives of individuals who suffered, reduced to minor characters in the extension of colonial borders and cane-field capitalism, relative to the significant knowledge that we have of the white historical figures of the humanitarians? In the appendices, we have, in addition to fragments, silence laborers who could not give testimonials because they were killed, either for not completing their tasks or at the hand of intimate partners. Do we turn to Saidiya Hartman's methods of critical fabulation to imagine what cannot be verified? My grandfather, who learned Hindi from an itinerant teacher across the border in Suriname, passed his Hindi interpreter exam and was appointed interpreter clerk in 1944 by D.L.B. Wickham, then Immigration Agent General. At the time of the report in 1871, interpreter positions would also have existed. However, the report itself does not mention languages such as Hindi or Bhojpuri. Rather, we see mention of testimonials in strange English, or individuals speaking Kuli, or in one case, Musalmani. These are then translated into the English of the report. The Kuli here is an object under investigation, but Kuli is also a verb, a process, indicated in the process of becoming Creole. Speaking Kuli then suggests cross-cultural interactions, not only between the laboring populations, but also with the white planter class. So even though that was an unequal process of mixing. So I'm wondering then, what would be the constraints if my grandfather had to formally interpret in this kind of context? Would he, as a minor but still colonial official, have been able to transcend the language of supply and savings of indentured laborers to communicate the inner feelings and bodily pain of being Kuli? How do we honor the opacities of these experiences recorded in the archives when the language of the Kuli is not available to us? Many writers of indentureship and its aftermath have not surprisingly turned to family archives to understand the affect within the archive. I'm thinking here of Clem Cicheran's narration of his grandmother, Amar Wahab's opening to disciplining coolies that begins with his father, Gayatri Bahadur's quest spurred by her grandmother, Maria Kaladeen's work that takes inspiration from her father, as we just saw, and many others. So I want to advocate here for a multiplicity of these stories that come from the ancestors towards a certain production of truth, perhaps one that differs from the inquiry. Lisa Lowe uses the concept of intimacy not in the sense of a personal and familial relation, but to center overlapping histories of liberal modernity, slavery, indentureship, and the seizure of indigenous land. This concept of intimacy is a point that is perhaps easily understood in the Caribbean, because to discuss any historical event in the Caribbean is to talk at the crossroads. So for example, if we think about Black Power in Trinidad in 1970, we also think of the March on Caroni. So in the historical records, these kind of complications appear separated and distant. And again, this is courtesy of Julianne Lee. And in this image, which is an ad from 1928, also appearing in the Gleaner for modern electricity, we see that electricity can replace the cheap but outdated mechanical laboring body of the coolie with the value of electrical servants. Note the coolie in this ad is located in the Far East, distant from the modern location of Jamaica in the Western Hemisphere, and deliberately forgets a more proximate history. As a counter to this kind of forgetting, I'm drawn to Dabydeen's epilogue in The Counting House, which offers a succinct and beautiful joining up of Indian, African, Indigenous, and British histories through both presence and mystery, research and imagination, and perhaps even a reframing of colonial mastery found in the title Stipendiary Magistrate and Superintendent of Rivers and Creeks of Devu. Dabydeen links these vast histories across peoples and links people to place, to the natural environment, as well as to dispossession. And so Although I turned to the Commission of Inquiry to look for agency and resistance, I think the more interesting questions, as Dabydeen's epilogue suggests, are questions of translation, intimacy, distance and proximity, memory and forgetting in the historical document. As a descendant of indentured laborers, how do we situate ourselves and the histories we walk in through this report? Why do I desire the evidential traces of paper archives when I carry the inheritance of memories? What is the relation of my well-fed body in relation to the meager bodies in and of the archive? The location of my body in foreign complicates direct linkages back to this history, but my body as a form of politics carries it forward. As a result, I must ask myself, how do I take seriously affect within the indentureship archive? And I don't ask these questions to turn away from the report, but rather to think with my grandfather and with the ancestors about an entangled relationship between colonizer and colonized, between the practices of benevolent white savior invested in an impartial partiality and the navigations of the coolie within the white structures. I wonder, how do these knowledges situated between the personal and the official shift across temporalities? That is, how do they depart from discrete notions of time embedded in the archive and travel with us across fractured diasporic spaces? Why is it that my Aja in his apartment in St. Jamestown, Toronto, made a point of telling me that there was once a great man, an Englishman named Crosby, who fought for our people, and that it was important to remember the various ways we encountered each other on the plantation. For my grandfather, remembering white historical figures on the plantation as carrying the potential for fairness highlighted, I think, his own struggle to resist the dehumanizing lens of the colonial gaze under which he lived, and to imagine, or at least hope, for a, quote, relationally different future, a term that I borrow from Shona Hunter. And I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Nalini. It's wonderful to have a new interpretation and a fresh take on that crucial piece of indentured history in Guyana. So thank you so much. I love the way you paid homage to all those texts like India and the Caribbean as well. I've got some questions. Do keep putting your questions in the Q&A. I've got a question here from Eric. Nalini, which is about how effective you think that Crosby was, and that's kind of considering that the all the action took place during his time, all the action that precipitated the inquiry took place during his time as the Agent General of Immigration.
Yeah, well, I would say that probably quite effective enough to scare the governor, Hinks, right? Who, as you know, took him off his duties because he tried to prosecute overseers for an abuse against a Chinese laborer, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and also limited his powers. I think that was part of DeVoe's representation.
Yes.
Did you say something? Please, everybody, keep typing your questions into the Q&A. I think we caught you short because we probably finished just slightly earlier than everybody was expecting. So we've surprised the audience. You didn't say anything about cannibalism in your talk, did you?
Yes, I did.
You did? Yes. Okay. I just saw the question and I thought, I was awake the entire time. How have I missed this? All right. Okay, that's me then. So it says a very enriching presentation. This is from our dear colleague we met in 2017, Nalini, Rajrani Gobin. And very enriching presentation. The fact about cannibalism among the coolies is new to me. What is the source of this information? Is it reliable?
Yes, well, it appears in the Gleaner, the Jamaican newspaper. It's from 1876, and actually, let me just put it up because I have it here. Sorry, just technical issues. Okay. Here. So it's a report on a session in the Supreme Criminal Court for Demerara, where Bhawani pleads guilty to an indictment charging him with disinterring the dead body of another coolie man and eating part of it. He was sentenced to 12 months prison with hard labor. You're muted.
Thank you so much. So I've got a question from Stefanos Stefanidis, who says that he's really interested in the issue of interpreting that you spoke about in your grandfather's experience. Could you say more and share some sources? And he goes on to say the question of translation and interpretation in the transcultural process is interesting.
It is, and I'm not really an expert in translation. I would actually recommend people probably should turn to Rajiv Mohabir's work on translation. But I do find it, interesting to think about that what we think we know, right, that is just the snippets, the fragments of testimonials that's appearing in the report as fact was often interpreted not in a language that was spoken in a standard way, but probably from an amalgamation of, Creole, Bhojpuri, English, and so on. We know from the records in Trinidad, for example, that the first language that indentured laborers spoke as a kind of lingua franca was actually French Creole. In Guyana, I think it was Bhojpuri, but, what does, working across those multiple languages and geographical regions, what are we missing? What are the gaps that we might need to imagine? But I don't want to completely lose what's in the text either. So I'm not, suggesting that we completely forgo the text and only, speak of the absences, because there is also the presence there.
I don't know if you can see, Nalini, but you've got so many comments here thanking you for an excellent lecture, wonderful talk. Thank you so much, that it's thought-provoking and everybody's enjoying it so much. I've got a question here from Claire Parfit, who says, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'd love to hear your own thoughts about your question of why you desire evidence from the archive when you hold the history in your body. Claire says that she feels this tension in her own research, but this is the first time she's heard someone else articulate it. She adds, how do we balance archival evidence against oral histories and other forms of memory, such as embodied practice?
Thank you so much for commiserating with me. And I think I just also wanted to thank the Institute, because this is such a unique space where we can have these conversations. And I couldn't imagine being this vulnerable in another, more formal setting to speak about these issues. And it always feels hard, especially, to think about people that are no longer with us. My grandfather was here when I started grad school, but he's since passed away. So I guess for me, I do want to honor the knowledge that I have of indentureship, which I feel comes equally from these stories that are passed down as they do from books. And I know that, critical race studies creates the space where we can tell our stories. But there's something about, particularly when you're working in the field of history and you're entering in the archive. And I was just speaking about this with my colleague, Ronald Cummings, yesterday, about our experience of entering in to an institutional archive. And Amar Wahab speaks about this in his book as well. The archives are guarded, right? And you very much feel like your body, is an intrusion, that there are things that you're not meant to see. And then, you know, and it's somehow you've managed to extract those details from the archives, and then you have to present it in front of an audience, you know, in a university setting that is probably predominantly white, and expecting you to act with a certain kind of detachment to these documents. And I guess I'm still struggling with what is the process, you know, how do we go about opening up these archives to the multiplicities of stories that we all hold, and to have that be taken seriously.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. A question from Fabian. Thanks for a great presentation, Nalini. Do you think that well-established categories like post-colonial that are frequently applied to the larger discourse have become too narrow and prescriptive to encompass all the aspects that might be useful for our understanding of these complex matters?
And again, in conversation with my colleague, with my colleagues here, Faisal-Dean and also Ronald Cummings, we talk about this a lot, because the post-colonial is maybe one of the few spaces that we're visible in the academy, right, where there's space for this kind of work to do. So, you know, in some ways we are marketing our work to fit the need of a academy that's interested in, you know, equity, diversity, and inclusion, through which the post-colonial becomes a, you know, point of entry. In an interview we did with Ronald and I did with Frank Birbal Singh, Frank has quite a healthy suspicion of the term post-colonial, which, you know, was when he started teaching Caribbean literature in the 70s, was, you know, that term didn't exist. It was Commonwealth literature still. And for him, that held meaning because he, you know, grew up like under empire, and Commonwealth still held, you know, a certain frame of reference in terms of the circulation of ideas and texts and commonalities. And his suspicion came from the fact that the post-colonial were people from Canada and Australia that were using this term post-colonial. Again, white figures who did not have the same experiences of empire that he did. And it was not something that he could ever see himself using. And I think that conversation has stayed with me, and I have this very vexed relationship with it.
Nalini, thank you so much. I'm just going to chat for a second, just in case there's anybody who is, if you're feeling shy, I can promise you that I've known Nalini for almost 15 years now, and she is the warmest of scholars. So please don't be shy if you are. But just to add that I am so fortunate, I'm working, I had the opportunity this year to work on a publication with Nalini. And that's an anthology that I read from just before we went to the break, and it's called The Other Windrush. And all the delegates at this conference today can purchase The Other Windrush at 30% off by going to Pluto. One of my colleagues is gonna put directions in there. But I need to say, not only is Nalini a wonderful scholar, she's an incredible writer, because she's written a fantastic chapter for The Other Windrush. And you'll have a chance to read it when it comes out it's coming out in time for Windrush Day here. So do go online and order it if you want to hear more. Who doesn't want to hear more from Nalini and Maria? Sita Narayan asks, Nalini, did you ever trace your roots in India?
I did, because I was in India. And it's not a easy reunification, family reunification. I traced, my great-grandmother comes from Ajmer in Rajasthan. And according to the indenture, the emigration passes in Guyana, one grandparent was Hindu, one was Muslim. so I imagine this beautiful romantic love story that, was the reason that they left India and came to Guyana, but who knows? But Ajmer, of course, is a city, and you don't, I don't know what I was thinking that I could go to Ajmer and that somebody would remember somebody, but you never know. So I went to the Dargah in Ajmer, actually with Narinder Milkom Singh, who's an ethnomusicologist at the Universitat von Paramaribo in Suriname, and inquired as to whether there were any records of weddings, and because I thought maybe that would be my best shot. But there wasn't. I went to the archives in Ajmer and discovered that the property rolls, which I thought might lead to another clue, were recorded in Persian script, and there wasn't anybody in the archives that read the Persian script anymore. So I kind of was ended up at a dead end.
Thanks so much, Nalini. That was a wonderful talk. Nalini is on Twitter. I'm going to type her handle into the chat as we move on to the next panel. And just to say, let me make sure I haven't missed anyone out. No, I haven't missed anyone out. Just to say thank you so much to you, Nalini, for taking the time to do this. We're all aware, everybody at the Ameena Gafoor Institute is aware of the kind of immense pressures on people teaching in universities at the moment, and the extra workload that's been caused by the pandemic. So we're so grateful to you for being here today and sharing your research with us first. Thank you so much.
Maria, just before you go to the next panel, can I just say again, a huge thanks for including me, for being so generous and kind, and just being a dear friend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nalini. We've got a wonderful 3 more papers to go this afternoon, and I would like to begin, but let me just make sure I've got everybody ready for this afternoon. So first off, we have. Oh, fantastic! Do we have Christopher first? Is that right, Christopher? You can turn your mic on if I'm right. No, we don't. We have. No. Am I right?
I don't think so, but I can go first if you'd like.
Kristen, my apologies, it's Kristen. Kristen, could you kindly, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. So I'm very pleased to introduce Kristen Roebuck from Cornell University, who's going to be joining us in just a second. And Kristen is presenting a paper. Kristen is presenting a paper entitled Remembering Girl Zero, Trans-Pacific Patriliny, Indenture and the Failure of Emancipation. So just slightly earlier than expected. So thank you so much for joining us, Kristen. And you should be able to share screen now. I'm just going to make myself disappear and let you get on with it.
Okay, thanks so much for having me today. I'm very happy to speak. It's been a really interesting and educational conference so far. So I'm sort of shifting our geographic focus to East Asia. I'm a historian of Japan, and we'll be talking about one case in particular that I think illuminates broader trends in the sort of debates over indenture and slavery in East Asia in the late 19th century, and how that was entangled also with Western empires and international law. So in July of 1872, a ship en route from Macau to Peru, captained by Peruvian naval officer Ricardo Herrero, made an unplanned stop in the booming Pacific Treaty port of Yokohama, Japan. And the storm that diverted Maria Luz into Japanese waters for repairs was just one of a series of disasters that was typical of the early modern slave trade. that befell Maria Luce in its brief aborted journey. 7 Chinese aboard Maria Luce had perished in the weeks since sailing from Macau, and 3 of these died after jumping overboard. Meanwhile, those still breathing conspired to set Maria Luce ablaze. Like jumping overboard, setting one's own ship afire was a tactic chosen by captives with no other means of liberation. These desperate methods were made conventional by the routine brutalities of transoceanic slave trading and coolie trafficking. By 1872, Captain Herrero had trafficked some 3,000 Chinese from Macau to Peru. And in addition to profit, one benefit of his long experience was to recognize instantly the threat on discovering Chinese aboard his ship secretly stockpiling straw and wood as kindling. To put down what he described as an attempted, quote, revolution, Herrero therefore ordered the insurgents bound, beaten, and locked in leg irons. 2 weeks later, shortly before directing his battered ship into Yokohama Bay, Herrero ordered the irons removed. Now, the timing is no accident. Herrero knew he would encounter British and US ships and government agents in Yokohama. By 1872, both powers had diplomatic relations with Japan, and both had declared their commitment to extirpating slavery and the slave trade, along with the doppelganger coolie trade flowing from colonial wellsprings like Macau to the New World. Japan's new government, founded in the wake of the Revolution of 1868, was still undeclared on the international slave and coolie trades. So Herrero attempted to avoid trouble in the international port by keeping most of the roughly 250 Chinese aboard his ship, excepting members of his crew and a girl that he kept in his cabin, confined in the ship's cramped and poorly ventilated hold. Yet in one escape attempt after another, dozens of Chinese jumped from Maria Luce into Yokohama Bay. Many of these could not swim, and most Herrero were captured. But a strong and determined swimmer named Mo Hing finally made it overboard under cover of night and all the way to a British vessel, the Iron Duke. Now, from the Iron Duke, suspicions about Maria Luce spread rapidly through Yokohama's international community, its journalists, foreign consuls, Chinese residents, Japanese authorities, and without much delay, politicians and newspaper reading publics around the world. For decades after the fact, Japanese Foreign Minister Soejima Taneyomi and other eminent men would vie to take credit for what American journalist E.H. House at the time termed, quote, the cause célèbre of the Maria Luce and the absolute release of the coolie captives, end quote, on board. To give just one example of men taking credit for this cause célèbre, British Judge Edmund Hornby later claimed, actually 50 years later in a memoir, that he himself had masterminded from behind the scenes both the rescue of the Chinese captives from the Maria Luce and the subsequent destruction of the entire Macau-based coolie trade. None of these exultant men mention the female under 20 years of age whom Captain Herrero kept while the men and boys were set free. Girl Zero was one of 13 minors Herrero testified he bought, quote, for myself in Macau and was transporting to Peru to serve him personally. For the 12 boys, he paid $45 to $50 each in what he described as legitimate transactions with their families. He could not remember the price he paid for the girl that he kept in his cabin, but as he testified in Japanese court, quote, I have the receipt. Yet in 20th century discussions of the Maria Luce case, Foreign Minister Soejima, like others, omitted mention of Girl Zero while celebrating the blow he and Japan struck jointly against global slave trading. Subsequent generations have rewarded Soejima by repeating the encomia and deepening the silence. In addition to 3 major compilations of legal and diplomatic records, I've studied over 120 sources, secondary sources, on the Maria Luce incident, published between 1872 and 2020. All 3 primary source compilations specify, in 3 languages, English, Japanese, and Chinese, that authorities in Yokohama found a girl among those Chinese that Herrero held on Maria Luce. Yet over 110 secondary sources fail to mention her. That's well over 90%. Only a handful note that Girl Zero alone of all those on board Maria Luce was not freed. So if you dig deep enough through thousands of pages written about the anguished male captives and heroic male emancipators who changed the world by freeing them, you may find 12 suffocating sentences about the girl not freed. So how does one write a story about an encounter with nothing, It's a question posed by historian and literary scholar Saidiya Hartman, confronting, quote, the impossibility of recovering the stories of the enslaved. I call the unliberated girl zero because British, American, and Japanese authorities investigating the Maria Luce assigned to each of the Chinese on board a number, but they did not count girl zero. Furthermore, those authorities and the men who created the archive never recorded her name, nor her age or hometown, how she came to be in Macau or for sale, or in Herrera's cabin, whether she wanted to leave, where she wanted to go, what she grieved in her past or hoped for her future. So how can we resist the archive's ignorance and indifference about girl zero, who deserved a better name and a better fate? There's no fully satisfying answer, but we can begin by searching for patterns across time and space and making intelligent inferences. And one of these, I think, is that Ricardo Herrero probably used girl zero for sex in addition to other forms of labor. Such liberties were routinely taken by slavers who deprived women and girls of their liberties. The institutionalization of rape was one of the benefits of employment for men on a slave ship. But archives tend to omit rather than capture such routines. So it comes as a relief when historian Shimoju Kiyoshi breaks 140 years of silence on the sexual exploitation implicit in the Maria Luce case. Yet even Shimoju stumbles over how to depict the sexual and legal relation between Herrero, the girl he purchased, and the governments who licensed that transaction. Shimoju writes that Herrero, quote, abducted girl zero, but authorities and witnesses in Macau and Japan treated the transaction by which he took possession of her as legitimate. So apparently do the vast majority of scholars who do not note girl zero as an exception to the purported rule that in the Maria Luce incident, and this is to quote a very eminent scholar of Japan, Donald Keene, quote, all the Chinese were permitted to go ashore in Yokohama and set free, end quote. Girl zero may, in fact, have been abducted, but probably not by Herrero, who had his lawful receipt for her. The booming market for women and girls throughout European and Asian jurisdictions in the Asia-Pacific region made abduction for profit a perennial possibility. But the fact is that rightful sales of females by their kin were more common than illicit abduction. Most likely, girl zero was sold by her kin for a useful sum of cash. Terming Herrero an abductor misplaces the blame for her trafficking one-sidedly on Herrero as an outlaw and outsider, rather than acknowledging that he was a banal man operating within the open markets, legal regimes, kinship structures, and gender roles of his time. Further muddying the water, Shimoju terms girl zero Herrero's, quote, lover or mistress, shofu in Japanese. However, translated, that term implies consent, which girl zero was in no position to withhold and therefore did not give. Now, even the tiny minority of scholars who do not omit girl zero make little effort to explain why she went unliberated. Most join Shimoju in offering just a few short words which serve to shield everyone but Herrero from blame by describing him as a rogue agent who, quote, abducted or escaped or eloped with her. These scholars fail to specify that authorities in Yokohama chose to leave her in Herrero's custody, much less do they ponder why, or how that mode of governance constructs femininity as freedom foreclosed. Daniel Botsman provides the exception in a single footnote, which only restates the justification given by Japanese authorities. Quote, she appeared well fed and clothed with no signs of abuse. For this reason, and because she had no other legal guardian, it was decided to leave her in the custody of the captain. It's worth noting here, Botsman's language, it was decided to leave her. He doesn't even specify who made that decision. So Botsman doesn't explore the reasons to be skeptical about this justification, which include that sexual and other forms of abuse might not be visible at a glance, and that being fed and clothed is not the same as being free. Now, authorities in Yokohama knew this. Their mandate for liberating men and boys aboard Maria Luce didn't hinge on the quality of their clothing or the fact that the boys didn't have another legal guardian to take custody of them in Yokohama. Now, it may be true, if a misdirection, that Herrero kept girl zero well fed and clothed. It may also be true that he spared her the violence he visited upon men and boys under his authority. Personally, I think we have grounds to doubt his benevolence, but given the choices made by the men who shaped the archive, there's really no way to know. So let's examine how that archive formed. In early August 1872, after Mohing escaped to the Iron Duke and British and US consuls urged Foreign Minister Soejima to intervene. Soejima instructed Oetaku, who was the governor of Kanagawa, where Yokohama is located, to carry out a, quote, strict investigation of the Maria Luz. So Governor Oe then directed E.S. Benson, who was director of the municipal office in Yokohama, to board and scrutinize the ship. Through an interpreter, Benson questioned some of the coolies below deck, who replied that they were well-fed and well-treated. Even so, some, quote, begged assistance in escaping Maria Luz and returning home to China. In reporting these findings, Benson warned Governor Oe that Herrero, quote, would be ready for sea in 3 days. And he urged Oe, quote, to seriously consider whether the fear of punishment has not strongly influenced these men against making any complaint against the captain. In response, Governor Oe removed over 200 Chinese men and boys from the ship to question and safekeep them, leaving Girl Zero in Herrero's cabin. It's important to note that Benson wasn't alone in visiting and inspecting the Maria Luz. Men of several nations boarded the ship to investigate it over the months it waited in Yokohama harbor, and there's no evidence that any of them ever acted to release Girl Zero. Once ashore, Herrero's former captives testified to violent abuse at his hands, humiliations, forced confinement, and deprivation of food and possibly even water. Their testimony contradicted Benson's initial report that he found the coolies below deck in tolerably, quote, comfortable quarters, their general appearance giving no indication of insufficient food or bad usage. Apparently, abuse and hunger cannot be seen at a glance. One must permit the subaltern to speak. Having done so, with a notable exception of Girl Zero, Governor Oe, who was also the judge overseeing the case, sustained, quote, the charge preferred against the captain that he had abused the passengers and restrained them by force from leaving the vessel, end quote. Then he pardoned Captain Herrero of this crime and left him free. Oe's investigation concluded he left it up to each Chinese boy and man whether he would choose or not to re-embark Maria Luz, and none of them did. Herrero therefore sued those Chinese men and boys to compel them to re-embark the ship and perform the specific terms of their contracts of indenture to travel to and labor in Peru. Now, he didn't have to sue Girl Zero because she was still in his custody. As a result, she was excluded from the second stage of legal proceedings as well. In late September 1872, Oe issued his celebrated final verdict in a font of flowery rhetoric about natural justice and equity, the inviolable principle of, quote, free and voluntary consent, unquote, of migrants, and, quote, slavery, a state so repugnant to all sense of natural justice, end quote, as to render both Herrero's contracts of indenture and the entire coolie trade flowing from Macau illegitimate in the eyes of the Japanese court. Oe ruled against Herrero. Thus ended the great legal drama followed around the world. The ruling was unequivocal, in the words of one scholar, except in the sense that Girl Zero was never mentioned. Now, the same day Oe handed down his verdict, an imperial envoy from the Qing Empire, Chen Fuxun, arrived in Yokohama to escort home the more than 200 trafficked Chinese, now freed, among whom, as he put it, are, quote, 12 grandsons and 1 granddaughter, end quote. The government of Japan, drunk on acclaim from the anti-slaving publics of the world, proudly delivered to Chen 217 sons and 12 grandsons, but no granddaughter. Chen does not appear to have noted the discrepancy for several days, but on 3 October, he finally wrote to Foreign Minister Soejima a reminder that among these 230 people, there is 1 granddaughter still aboard the ship and not relinquished, end quote. Now, that Chen would insist on recovering not only the sons and grandsons of China, but even a lowly granddaughter, came as a surprise to Japanese authorities. The lack of a strong principle or determination of facts mandating Girl Zero's abandonment to Captain Herrero let Japan move quickly to take possession of her once any other man showed an interest in her. First, they deferred to Herrero's possessory interest in her. Now they deferred to Chen's. At no moment did they consider that Girl Zero belonged to herself. Soejima ordered Governor Oe to produce her, so Governor Oe ordered police to board the Maria Luz once again and bring Girl Zero ashore. On 5 October, Sergeant S. Langdell submitted a one-sentence report on this belated effort. Captain Herrero, whom OA had granted both his freedom and custody of Girl Zero, had taken her from Mauritius to an American mail ship on 3 October and steamed from Yokohama the same night. The fact that Girl Zero eluded OA at the very moment multiple authorities in Yokohama assigned her value put OA in an awkward position. And it's at this moment of diplomatic discomfiture that bureaucrats, including OA, attempting to justify ex post facto their failure to liberate Girl Zero, inserted into the record evidence for the claim that she was not a slave or a trafficked coolie, but rather a pampered pet. OA sent this justification to Foreign Minister Soejima on 9 October, along with notice that she was beyond reach. Now, because Girl Zero was never called to testify, OA could not report anything that she had said about her situation. Instead, he relied entirely on reports of visual and spatial cues given to him by men who inspected the ship to characterize her situation. For example, as evidence that Girl Zero was not in need of liberating, OA wrote that, quote, her face was plump and clothing appropriate to the season, end quote. But recall that Benson could not tell when he went to observe men and boys below deck that they had suffered abuse or hunger. OA further alleged that investigators, quote, saw no evidence of harsh treatment, end quote. But what they saw and what Girl Zero survived are separate matters. And what was Girl Zero doing on the ship that OA himself denounced as a vehicle of tyranny, torture, and illegal forced migration tantamount to slavery? OA explained it this way, quote, the girl was touring in the cabin, end quote. The suggestion that Girl Zero was essentially traveling for pleasure in the cabin of a violent slave trader with whom she shared no language or capacity to communicate strains credulity, but so the record states. Now, it was perhaps with such doubts in mind that OA added defensively that, quote, neither, of course, from the girl nor from anyone else was complaint tendered, end quote, during the investigation or trials he oversaw. It's plausible that OA, an ambitious official just 24 years old, felt betrayed by the many subordinates, supervisors, foreign legal advisors, attorneys, and diplomats involved in the case, none of whom warned him to take Girl Zero into protective custody. In forging a record for why Girl Zero went unliberated, he cited one such expert repeatedly, namely U.S. Attorney G.W. Hill, who was OA's official legal advisor as governor of Kanagawa. And this is a moment, I should note, in Japanese history where this newly established Japanese government is working very hard to try to, quote unquote, civilize its institutions of rule and westernize its legal structures in order to try to renegotiate unequal treaties. And so that's why there are so many foreign legal advisors at work on this case in Yokohama at this time. So by citing G.W. Hill repeatedly, OA maneuvered to deflect or share any blame that was to be laid. Meanwhile, he also worked to shift focus from his own inaction to Girl Zero's silence. Remember, he said she never complained. But how could Girl Zero file a complaint when she was held in Herrero's cabin and denied access to court and legal counsel? All of the Chinese men and boys above the ship actually got British lawyers to state their case in Japanese court. How could she have done so when over 200 Chinese men were so vulnerable to Herrero that they could not attest to their suffering until OA freed them from the ship? Now, the crowning piece of OA's laborious self-exculpation was his assertion that Herrero, quote, embraced Girl Zero as, quote, a dependent. Now, with this linguistic sleight of hand, he defined her as lawful kin and therefore not an unlawful captive to Herrero. But defining Girl Zero as a lawful dependent put OA perilously close to contradicting himself, given his flat rejection of Herrera's claim to custody over the other 12 children he had purchased in Macau, 12 boys. OA resolved this contradiction by appealing to patrilineal bias about the fungibility of females versus the inviolability of sons. Under Patriliny, while sons were prioritized as heirs, it was normal that daughters and granddaughters be natally alienated, expelled from their homes, circulated among and claimed by outside men as wives, concubines, adopted daughters, and sundry other, quote, dependents. Carefully sidestepping the similar circumstances that placed the 13 children on Maria Luce, OA focused instead on Girl Zero's placement on the ship as evidence of domestic relations. Quote, unlike the other Chinese passengers, she was left in the cabin and favored, end quote, by Herrero. OA constructed the cabin as a site of family and favor, rather than violence, rape, and enslavement. So the very facts indicating Herrero probably used Girl Zero as a sex slave were thus transformed into evidence he had a right to use her, because men do such things to female kin. Thus, OA sided with Herrero in the end, inventing an ex post facto legal justification for his unimpeded possession of the girl he had bought in Macau. Seen in this fresh judicial light, to have removed Girl Zero from Herrero's possession would have constituted a trespass against Herrero's rights, an outrageous abduction of his kin. And the point was largely moot, except insofar as it reflected on OA's competence and reinforced principles excluding females from freedom in the name of family values. The point was moot because Herrero had already removed Girl Zero from OA's jurisdiction. And as OA put it, quote, there is no method to take her back. Now on this final point too, there's room for doubt, as OA learned of Herrero's departure with Girl Zero by a slow mail steamer on a known heading within 36 hours or so. Had recovering Girl Zero been a priority, some effort might have been made. Instead, OA spent days crafting justifications for her absence before notifying Soejima on 9 October. One wonders whether OA might rather be rid of her, given that Girl Zero's reappearance might give her an opportunity to speak and undercut OA's version of events. That neither OA nor his advisor, G.W. Hill, suffered professional setback or reputational loss for their handling of the Maria Luce case and Girl Zero's case in particular shows how thoroughly normalized is female subjection and indeed trafficking, not only in their own day, but also I think in ours. Their unshaken standing also attests to the power of the men who craft the documentary record, while depriving Girl Zero and many other like her of a chance to speak. It was Hill who oversaw the compilation and publication in 1874 of the first multilingual compendium of diplomatic and legal records regarding the Maria Luce case. This volume confirmed the master narrative already established in Female Free Court and Reportage that all of Herrero's Chinese captives were freed. In Hill's heroic narrative, crafted through the faux neutrality of documentary evidence, Girl Zero barely flickers in and out of sight, swept away as detritus in the flood of other people's freedom. And I don't want to go over time, so there's a lot more to be said about this case and what it can tell us about bigger patterns of trafficking, particularly in women and girls in this region and many jurisdictions in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. But instead of getting into all of that, I will stop here and be very interested in questions and comments later on.
Kristen, thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk. I've seen in your biography as well that you have recently won a Fulbright scholarship to complete some more research on a similar theme in Japan. Is that right?
Yes, if coronavirus lets me travel, I will be going to Japan for a good long time, digging into the archives.
Many, many thanks for that excellent presentation. I know we're going to get a lot of questions in the chat, so we'll see you again shortly. Thank you. Christopher, could I ask you, I'm sure I've got it right this time. Could I ask you kindly to unmute and turn your camera on? I have to say, I last saw Christopher at the centenary event for the abolition of indentured labour, and he made a few of us cry in the audience.
Myself too.
Yeah. Don't make me cry. Christopher, it's my birthday. Christopher is currently at Anne Arundel Community College, where he's teaching. His paper today is entitled Music, Multiculturalism and Staging Indian Arrival in Trinidad. And you should be able to share screen with us. Thank you so much, Christopher.
Okay, so thank you all very much for the conference. Thanks to Kristen as well for a really nice paper. Also thanks to Carl Turbuli and Marina Carter, who gave me some comments on the paper that I'm about to talk about here. a version of which was published in their new anthology, Coolitude 2, which was launched by the Institute here last month. So here I go. In this paper, I discuss ways that Indian Trinidadians use music and theater to commemorate, remember, and reenact their ancestral arrival to the Caribbean within the context of tassa drumming competitions. I first review how notions of the ship and the plantation figure prominently in Indian Trinidadian cultural identity. I then discuss how the familiar narrative of Indian arrival is encoded in the very repertoire of tassa. And I finally discuss how this musical narrative of arrival is amplified in the context of tassa drumming competitions by use of theatrical elements, including representations of the ship, the plantation, and in one example, the imagining of African and Indian co-arrival. A foundational element of Indian Trinidadian collective memory is the commemoration of the first indentured laborers to arrive in the colony. This remembrance involves a relatively standard set of iconography and symbolic practices that recall ancestral arrival while also referencing struggles for cultural, economic, and national identity in the post-indenture period. Perhaps foremost among these symbols is the ship, an icon which represents the literal voyage from India, but also signals a more fundamental rupture, one with intergenerational impact. For those indentured, the crossing of the sea was profoundly disorienting, separation from family, friends, and the life they knew. Yet just as the ship represents a certain destruction of identity, it also represents the construction of new identities born from the circumstances and legacies of bound labor. The plantation is another powerful symbol involved in the commemoration of Indian arrival. As an element of remembrance, the plantation evokes memories of the exploitation of indentured labor, while simultaneously conjuring strong feelings of nostalgia for times past. Sugarcane cultivation is a persistent reminder of plantation labor, where sugar, like the ship, lay at the heart of transoceanic collective memory. In this way, retellings of Indian arrival frequently evoke notions of the ship and the plantation as part of a web of signs and signifiers that remember the past and bring it to bear on the present. For example, this image is reproduced from an advertisement created by the National Gas Company of Trinidad and Tobago that appeared in the 2015 Indian Arrival Day commemorative magazine published by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center. The image features a sari-clad woman standing upright in a small boat. Fabric matching her outfit, perhaps it's an oversized orni or headscarf, catches the wind like a sail, pushing the vessel toward the left of the frame, a direction cartographically equivalent to the west. This directionality is confirmed by the setting sun in the same region of the image. These subtleties suggest movement from east to west, from India to the Caribbean, yet references to both locales appear together. Lotus flowers, symbols of divinity, speck the water surrounding the boat, while a group of scarlet ibises, Trinidad and Tobago's national bird, soar in the background. Text above the image in part reads, "We are all fruit bearers of their arduous journey, the heritage of their work ethic and heirs to their perseverance." Such a fanciful representation of the voyage and homage to Indian arrival simultaneously exemplifies the tensions and resolutions of a Coolitudian reconstruction of memory. Icons of Indianness sit comfortably alongside symbols of Trinidad. All this set upon the master symbol of the ship, in this case, a modest fishing boat that imagines itself a majestic seagoing vessel. These references provide a backdrop for a reimagining of the oceanic crossing. Of course, missing from the image is the reality of the voyage, tightly packed holds of human cargo, weeks at sea, death, and disease. Emphasizing the journey but downplaying the harsh reality of it, this whimsical and ahistorical image nonetheless represents only a slightly more refined rendition of the ways that the indentured voyage and arrival are represented in popular discourse. For example, this image depicts the Indian arrival monument in Cedros, a fishing village on the southern peninsula of Trinidad. Here, a small boat stands in for the Fatal Razak, the vessel that brought the first indentured Indians to Trinidad in 1845. A family, father, mother, and child sail together inside the boat, again with eyes and bodies facing west toward the Caribbean. Meanwhile, this image depicts typical Indian arrival day festivities. Here again, we see a small boat meant to represent the Fatul Razak, this time with a single female occupant, the bow decorated with stalks of sugarcane. In these kinds of representations, notions of the ship and the plantation collapse into a familiar narrative of Indian arrival that is frequently retold and reenacted in a wide variety of venues and occasions. I now turn to Tassa drumming to illustrate how notions of arrival, emergence, and creolization are encoded in the music itself and further dramatized in the context of Tassa drumming competitions. Tassa was brought to Trinidad during the Indenture period. Though derived from fragments of various North Indian musical traditions, for example, Nagara drumming and rhythms distilled from folk, devotional, and semi-classical genres, Tassa's most direct antecedent is Dol Tasha, a style widespread across parts of South Asia. Trinidadian Tassa derives from a Dol Tasha variant common in Northeast India that comprises one or more shallow kettle drums called Tasha and at least one double-headed bass drum called Dol. In Trinidad today, the term Tassa refers to the bowl-shaped drum, which is called Tassa, and to the ensemble within which it plays a central role. Over time, Tassa drumming has become an icon of Indianness in Trinidad as it accompanies a wide variety of Hindu, Muslim, and secular events within the Indian Trinidadian community. It plays an especially important role in Hindu weddings and Hoseh, the local Muharram observance. Such is Tassa's importance as both music and symbol that stakeholders have waged a vocal, though so far futile, campaign to make the Tassa a co-national instrument alongside the steel pan, Trinidad and Tobago's current national instrument. In a traditional performance context like that of a Hindu wedding, Tassa bands typically play a suite of 4 or 5 rhythms, usually with little to no pause in between. Drummers always begin with a rhythm called tikora, named for the now obsolete North Indian tikara drum, and integrating typical patterns played on it. Next are one or more so-called classical rhythms, austere compositions adapted from the rhythms of local classical and semi-classical singing traditions. The performance then proceeds to up-tempo music meant for dancing, such as the rhythm called calypso, which features elements drawn from the African Trinidadian musical genre of the same name. There's a formal logic inherent in this musical progression, a relatively sedate musical introduction blossoming into a loud, fast conclusion. However, this sequence also conveniently maps the general trajectory of the Indian Trinidadian experience as it progresses from rhythms associated with India, that is tikora and classical rhythms, to dancing rhythms, most of which are regarded as emerging from the mixing of cultures in diaspora. This musical sequence then suggests a loose narrative about Indian origins, arrival, and integration into Creole society, a narrative quite clear to the musicians themselves, who in the context of Tassa competitions routinely build spectacular stage performances that musically and theatrically imagine and reimagine Indian arrival in dialogue with the ideal of diasporic cultural harmony. The first national Tassa competition, called Tassa Tal, was organized in 1984 and remains a popular annual event. Since then, numerous governmental, cultural, and commercial organizations have established more or less prestigious Tassa contests in which bands are judged on their ability to blend tradition with innovation in flashy stage presentations. In the 2 examples that follow, I've edited performances to fit my presentation. In practice, however, competition performances last about 10 minutes and virtually always feature a rhythmic progression, beginning with tikora, moving to classical rhythms, and ending with dancing rhythms. Thus, performances tend to follow the standard musical progression I described previously. Though contest rules vary, bands routinely enliven performances with dancers, actors, props, set pieces, special lighting plots, and even pyrotechnics to capture the attention of audiences and judges, and to elaborate on the musical narrative, to reflect on the place of Indian Trinidadian culture within the broader setting of Trinidadian multiculturalism. My first example is from a competition as part of the 2016 Indian Arrival Day festivities in the town of Gasparillo in central Trinidad, featuring a band called Dragon Boys Tassa Group. I present this performance as a rather typical or perhaps stereotypical Tassa competition performance, in that it employs familiar tropes drawn from the Indian arrival narrative, particularly in its depictions of the ship in the plantation. In the following video, I include two clips from the performance. The first features the band playing Tikora, while actors shuffle into view sailing aboard a cardboard replica of the Fat el Razak. The second clip begins at the transition from the second rhythm to the third, a rhythm called Nagara, which is named for the North Indian Nagara drums and comprises patterns typically played on them. Having just disembarked the Fat el Razak, two male characters start cutting sugarcane that had been prepared in three large planters prior to the start of the performance. And I warn you, here comes some loud Tassa drumming. So if you're listening with headphones, be aware. The second example is from the 2019 National Tassarama Competition and features the band Trinidad and Tobago Sweet Tassa, directed by my mentor, Mr. Lenny Kumar. This performance yet again employs the familiar trope of the ship, yet cleverly plays on our expectations of its meaning. I present three clips from this performance to illustrate this point. The first features the Tassa rhythm Tikora, accompanied by a ship sailing across the stage. In this case, a large painting of a ship was carried from stage left to stage right, signaling an east-west trajectory. As viewers, we expect this ship to yet again represent the Fat el Razak and therefore Indian arrival. Yet just as the ship exits stage right, a group of actors begins crossing from stage right to stage left. We're meant to understand these are the passengers, new arrivals who have just disembarked from the ship. Among them are representations of migrants common in Indian arrival narratives, including some dressed in Indian attire and carrying Jahaji bundles. However, as the group walks across the stage, feigning weariness from the voyage, it becomes clear that among the group are actors also meant to represent African arrivals too. This Indian-African mix is signaled by costumes evoking both Indian and African dress, but is more apparent in the things they carry with them, namely Tassa drums and African drums. This co-arrival is meant to suggest that the trials and fortunes of African Trinidadians and Indian Trinidadians are irrevocably linked through shared histories of dislocation and hardship and the present reality of contemporary Creole society. Rather than emphasizing the real and enduring problem of racial animosities extending from the colonial era, the performance idealistically dwells on the positives of multiculturalism as the performance continues, highlighted by representations of Jose and Carnival. As the band plays a rhythm called chutney, this derived from the Indian Trinidadian folk song genre of the same name, A scene from Jose plays out downstage as a group of Tassa drummers miming their performance leads the procession of a small taja. In a final number, the band plays a rhythm called dingole, a dancing rhythm whose musical structure is derived primarily from Indian Trinidadian dolak rhythms, but is generally regarded as having been influenced by African Trinidadian drumming, especially since dingole is a Creole word meaning to dance. This notion of musical and cultural mixing is accompanied on stage by representations of carnival, a touchstone of local Creole identity. We first see an actor cross the stage playing a mock steel pan, this followed by an actor dancing a spectacular costume in typical carnival style. Each of these performances opens with a reenactment of Indian arrival that works to bridge time and space, connecting the moment of the ancestral voyage with present reflections on the purpose, practice, and experience of indenture and post-indenture. Such illustrates a reconstitution of memory in which imaginative notions of Indianness and Creoleness come together. This confusion of time and place constructs and enmeshes dynamic identities in a complex of repetition and action. Importantly, this notion is clear in the very sounds of the Tassa ensemble. Musical instruments, timbre, musical structure, and performance contexts mark Tassa as Indian, while these very same elements, by virtue of their repetition in diaspora, mark the Caribbean as home. The repertoire of Tassa reflects this notion, as it includes rhythms that drummers associate with Indian origins, those that enter the repertoire much later when already in diaspora, and those that bands or individuals are still composing today. In this way, the traditional progression of a suite of Tassa rhythms traces Indian roots and arrival through to the Creolizing present. The Dragon Boys performance features both playful and powerful remembrances of the past. The icon of the ship provides a foundational historical reference that sets the narrative in motion. This notion of arrival is further linked with the iconicity of the plantation as the new arrivals disembark their cardboard ship and take immediately to cutting cane. For Trinidad and Tobago Sweet Tassa, the ship similarly centers the subsequent narrative as born from the transoceanic voyage. This performance, however, cleverly plays with the audience's expectations by imagining an African and Indian co-arrival that riffs on the concept of Jahaji Bai. In reimagining Jahaji Bai as a bond not just among Indian immigrants, but between and among all those who came to Trinidad from across the oceans. The imagining of co-arrival is meant to reflect the Creolized and Creolizing legacies of the plantation while emphasizing cultural commonalities and social harmony. The assemblage of the ship, the plantation, and the sound of Tassa constitute an archive of indenture. Recollections of arrival are central to the stories Indian Trinidadians tell about themselves, and to others. In reenacting arrival, participants embody their ancestors' transformative journey and bring it to bear as a way of understanding the present. While memories of the ship and plantation are foundational to Indian Trinidadian identity, these icons are equally essential for African Trinidadians. The intertwined legacies of slavery and indenture make the narrative of co-arrival both possible and immediately understandable. As these performances show, the signifiers of Indian arrival may be familiar, but they are flexible enough to bend toward inclusivity in clever and socially productive ways. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much, Christopher. Many, many thanks. And a timely paper as well, because it's Indian Arrival Day, I believe, in Guyana as well. Thank you very much. Look forward to taking questions after after the next paper. I want to introduce Leah Khan, who is from the University of Michigan, and her paper today is Indentureship's Violences, Suicidal Masculinity in Indo-Guyana. And Leah is Assistant Professor of English and Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And I've been enjoying a copy of her wonderful book, Far from Mecca, just recently. So it's a pleasure to meet you in person and to listen to you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen with you. So let's just do that. Good morning from California. Thank you to the Ameena Gafoor Center for convening this important event, and to my fellow panelists, Kristen and Chris. I'd like to begin with a trigger warning. Please note that the subject of this paper is suicide, both historically and in the present. It's a distressing topic, so I ask that people be aware of their own limits in listening to and viewing the material. In September 2014, the World Health Organization published a report that gave Guyana a human development ranking no nation could ever want. Guyana was the country that had the highest suicide rate in the world. In a nation of less than 1 million people, Guyana had an age-standardized suicide rate of 44.2 per 100,000 inhabitants, as measured in 2012. No other nation, including the next two on the list, North and South Korea, had above 40 suicides per 100,000 people. The world average was 11.4 suicides per 100,000 persons. As the magazine The Economist noted, neighboring Suriname, with a similar history and ethnic mix, does very badly too. Suriname is a former Dutch colony that shares a South American border and a demographic history with Anglophone Guyana. Notably, both Suriname and Guyana have large numbers of citizens who are descended from 19th and early 20th century Indian indentured laborers. Demographically, as we know, Guyana is nearly evenly split between the descendants of African slaves and the descendants of Indian indentured laborers, that is, people who were brought from India by the British between 1838 and 1918 to work on their Caribbean sugar plantations after the colonial abolition of slavery. Guyana received the highest number of Indian indentured laborers, about 342,000, with Trinidad, Suriname, Guadeloupe, and Jamaica receiving statistically significant numbers. In this talk, I want to answer some who, how, and why questions about this high suicide rate that seem to befuddle everyone, particularly the Guyanese government. First, I want to make it clear who the primary victims of suicide in Guyana are. It's Indo-Guyanese people, and mostly men. Guyana's post-colonial inability to deal with racial conflict between Indo and Afro-Guyanese can have the secondary effect of eliding some socioeconomic and health issues that accrue to individual groups. In addition, I argue for a direct link between the contemporary suicide rate and gendered violence on the colonial sugar plantations of Guyana. The high rate of suicide in Guyana is neither an old statistic nor a new one. The most current World Health Organization data is for 2019. Guyana is now number 2 in the world for suicides, and Suriname is number 8. But it's also worth noting that the lowest standardized suicide rates in the world are also in the Caribbean. Numbers 1 to 4 of the countries with the lowest suicide rates in the world are first Antigua and Barbuda, then Barbados, Grenada, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. What's the difference? Primarily, it's demographic. Here's a map of Guyana and surrounding countries. As noted, Guyana and Suriname have large numbers of people of Indian descent, unlike the aforementioned Black majority islands that have the lowest suicide rates in the world. But then you might ask, as I have, what about Trinidad, which also has large numbers of people of Indian descent? It's a little outside of the scope of this paper, but I believe that accounting for the difference begins with the fact that Guyana and Suriname aren't islands. They are on the continent of South America and had plantations that were remote and isolated from each other with different colonial policies and demographic pressures. So, all right, things are still bad in Guyana, but they've always been bad. A study conducted 19 years ago by the Guyanese Center for Economic and Social Research under the auspices of the Pan American Health Organization and the World Health Organization concluded that Guyana's suicide rate was already among the highest in the Caribbean. This landmark study, dramatically titled The Shadow of Death, belatedly aroused the government's interest in this previously neglected sector of public health. The Pan Am WHO resident representative at the time, Dr. Bernadette Theodore Gandhi, urged Guyanese to avoid denying that suicide was a major health problem. This is 2 decades ago. The Guyanese government took little action. Researcher Kendrick Dans reported that, quote, the majority of persons committing suicide were young males below the age of 35 years. They were likely to be poorly educated, employed in low-income occupations, residing in the same community all their lives, and to be less likely to have children. A suicide cluster was identified in Blackbush Polder. You can see it indicated on the map here on the coast of Guyana, a community of the East Berbice Quarantine region, number 6. 52% of all Guyanese suicides occur in that region. Some media, though, also report that the majority of men who committed suicide are not young, that they are middle-aged or elderly. There is a clear, obvious dearth of research here, exacerbated by decades of incompetent, corrupt governance and a Ministry of Public Health that is seriously lacking in resources. Guyana was ranked 121st out of 187 countries on the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Index. Blackbush Polder, the site of this suicide cluster, where 52% of Guyanese suicides occur, is a very rural farming area. A polder is agricultural land reclaimed from the ocean and enclosed by levees and dikes built by the Dutch, who preceded the British as the colonizers of Guyana. A 2012 house-to-house community survey in the suicide cluster area of Blackbush Polder corroborated, as researcher Michael Falehi said, that persons of East Indian descent in Guyana, especially in farming areas, were more likely to attempt suicide. 81% of suicides were by Indian Guyanese, who comprise 44% of the country's population. In general, annual suicide rates have been consistently highest in this same East Berbice Quarantine region, so corroborated from multiple sources. And that general region is heavily populated by rural Indo-Guyanese towns, villages, and settlements. In 2010, the Guyanese then Minister of Health, Dr. Leslie Ramsamy, expressed his belief that it is not the case that more men commit suicide than women, but that women use less lethal methods, and that more men are successful in committing suicide than women. It's difficult to confirm this gendered claim, as attempted suicide is highly underreported everywhere in the world, and as I will discuss, it is also criminalized in Guyana. So the confirmed and staggering statistics may be summarized as follows. In 2014, Guyana had the highest per capita suicide rate in the world, and over 80% of these suicides were committed by Indo-Guyanese men in rural farming areas. Suicide in Guyana is both historically and contemporarily linked to the ingestion of agricultural pesticides. Sociologist Paulette Henry at the University of Guyana writes that there is a direct correlation between overexposures to agrochemicals, suicidal ideation, and suicide, and that agrochemicals heavily used in agricultural production is also the drug of choice for the majority of persons who commit or attempt suicide. Agrochemicals are not an unusual method of suicide worldwide, as global data show a high correlation between the use of agrochemicals and suicide. The World Health Organization 2012 report states that pesticide poisoning is one of the most common methods of suicide, especially in low and middle income countries, and accounts for 1/3 of the cases globally. The pesticides implicated in Guyana and elsewhere are a wide variety of insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, molluscicides, and other chemicals. People in Guyana and Trinidad have their own metonymic colloquial ways of referring to the act of a person taking his or her life by ingesting poison. Something you might know, in Guyana, it's called drinking malathion, which is an insecticide. And in Trinidad, it's called drinking gramazone, otherwise known as gramoxone or paraquat, an herbicide. Malathion and gramoxone are old agricultural pesticides to which sugar estate laborers had access. They're still used in both countries and in the US and around the world, but they remain the colloquial terms for all such ingested poisons. These substances are capable of killing all Caribbean pests, taking any kind of life that was an impediment to sugar plantation economics, from weeds to weevils to workers. There is then an old colonial link between the suicide phenomenon and an Indo-Caribbean indentureship, which is what I'm interested in thinking about. There's some sociological scholarship on Guyanese suicide rates, but there's been less historical effort made to link it to the British colonial legacy. The problem for comprehension and action, in my view, is that there is no singular cause of the high suicide rate and therefore no singular easy solution. It's a situation with a complex and interlinking set of causes. We can sum up 6 major reasons that account for the suicide phenomenon. First, poverty and lack of economic opportunity. Second, wide availability, access to, and overuse of farming chemicals, pesticides, and poisons. Third, patriarchal gender roles and related high rates of alcohol abuse and domestic violence against women and children. Fourth, what is sometimes referred to as the Werther effect of suicide contagion or copycat suicides by, in particular, young people who hear of others doing it. And fifth, severe religious and social stigma over mental health issues in Guyana and much of the Caribbean. As a result of this stigma, people do not generally seek psychiatric help, and there is little trained professional help available for those who do seek it. The 6th reason for the high suicide rate, I argue, is that it is a product of the colonial plantation history of suicide in Guyana. I'll start this part of the discussion by noting a crucial legal fact. Attempted suicide and abetting suicide are both criminal offenses under the law in Guyana. Chapter 8, sections 96 and 97 of the Criminal Law Offences Act classifies attempted suicide as manslaughter and a type of homicide. I'll read you the exact wording of the law. Everyone who counsels or procures any person to commit suicide actually committed in consequence of the counsel or procurement, or who aids or abets any person in the commission of suicide shall be guilty of felony and liable to imprisonment for life. Secondly, everyone who attempts to commit suicide shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and liable to imprisonment for 2 years. This law has 2 harsh implications. 1, any medical professional who assists a suicide or even mentions it to a patient may be imprisoned for life. And 2, any person who attempts to commit suicide and fails may be imprisoned for 2 years. This law is part of an arcane and archaic set of colonial laws derived from 19th century British common law. The suicide law dates from March 1894, almost 70 years before Guyanese independence, and it was last renewed in 1998. The other related Victorian era law that's come under a fair amount of fire recently is the one that criminalizes sodomy and undefined indecent acts between anyone of any sex, although same-sex relationships between men is specifically named in one legal provision. Sodomy, or legally it's still called by its Victorian name, buggery in Guyana, carries a life sentence. The Guyanese parliament has consistently refused to repeal that colonial law. High suicide rates in the Indo-Guyanese community date from the colonial era. On the sugar plantations of 19th and early 20th century British Guyana, along with rampant addiction to rum and narcotics, particularly ganja or marijuana, for numerous indentured men and women, The ultimate escape from the drabness and brutality of estate life was through suicide. Some hung themselves because they were unable or unwilling to submit to the degrading or severe manual labor expected of them. The vulnerability of women placed many tensions on indentured families and were another cause of suicides much discussed by colonial officials. Patricia Mohammed, one of the original theorizers of Caribbean post-colonial feminism, writes that the high male suicide rate was worrisome to colonial officials who blamed it on the alleged immorality of indentured Indian women. Indian women were also blamed for what British Guyanese planters and their advocates in London called the Coolie Wife murders, a series of homicides of indentured women, as documented by Gayatri Bahadur and others. This rash of murders of Indian women and the angst over their moral values and social roles is of course not due to Indian women's inherent immorality, but instead to an oppressed labor community in identity flux and the highly disproportionate numbers of male versus female indentured Indian immigrants in the Caribbean. The average percentage of women shipped from Calcutta to British Guyana was 38.2% in 1856, so at the height of indentureship, just a little over a third of the total. The British government found it difficult to recruit, quote, respectable Indian women to travel to the colonies, and many married male immigrants refused to bring their wives. A disproportionately large number of immigrant women were therefore young widows, runaways, dancers, prostitutes, and escapees from the drudgery of low-caste life. In frustration, the colonial government in Guyana declared that many female immigrants were antisocials, highly sexual, of dubious character, and outside the boundaries of decent colonial womanhood. As Kamala Kempadu says, the skewed perception of Indian women held by the British reinforced patriarchal tendencies within the Indian community in both India and the Caribbean, which found the women not only immoral, but corrupted sexual servants to non-Indian men. As such, indentured Indian women who were raped by white plantation overseers were blamed by both Indian and white men as morally deficient. In this colonial milieu, a tradition of pathological generational alcohol addiction began when indentured men were paid their wages in rum, the alcohol made from the sugarcane that they reaped on the plantation. Rum drinking continues to be associated with Indo-Caribbean masculinity. It's still frowned upon to some extent in Guyana for women to be seen in the homosocial spaces of rum shops and for them to drink in public. This is particularly true for Indo-Guyanese women, who are tasked with representing community piety and purity in religious and racial ways that are posed as oppositional to Afro-Guyanese and oppositional to Afro-Guyanese women. There's a paradoxical but persistent perception in Guyanese national discourse that not only are Indo-Guyanese more traditional and religious, but that they are also somehow more suicidal, more violent at home, and harder drinkers. The mentality of Indo-Guyanese is considered to forever be that of bung coolies to the sugar plantation. This idea begins with their confinement during indenture to the field and to the lodges, the old African slave barracks. Indians on the plantation were immediately reduced to their bare existence as coolie labor, and this metonymic identification endures post-colonially. Seeking professional, non-religious therapy or psychological assistance for mental health issues is also perceived as antithetical to Indo-Caribbean culture. People in distress are instead advised to consult Hindu, Muslim, Christian, or Obeah religious leaders, who most often advise them to simply pray more. Exorcisms may be conducted. Suicidal ideation and mental health issues are generally perceived in Guyana to be a sign of personal weakness and lack of faith, as Guyanese human rights activist Vidyarata Kisun has observed. Serena Coltress also names the hopelessness and frustration among men who are unable to fulfill their expected role as provider as a cause of alcoholism and suicide. Men who cannot or do not work are perceived to be insufficiently masculine, and seeking psychiatric help only exacerbates that perception. People also experience extreme family pressure to marry, to have children, and in general to perform what M. Jackie Alexander would call their heterosexual, nation-building, post-colonial Caribbean citizenship. One demographic breakdown that requires further scrutiny, and there's very little data on, is the number of suicide deaths of people who are gay, lesbian, trans, or otherwise queer, and who are the victims of extreme stigma in Guyana as they are elsewhere in the Caribbean. Guyanese perceived the World Health Organization suicide report in 2014 as an international embarrassment. For a week or two that September, the international press descended on that usually internationally insignificant country, seeking causes and answers that were difficult to find because of Guyana's weak infrastructure and its historical and demographic complexity. The media hunger for the personal story resulted in displays like this one, which to me is disturbing in the way that it exploits poor people's grief and trauma. Here is this man staged in a pose with the poison that killed his son. The many immigrant Guyanese living abroad in North America and England stepped in where the government failed, pushing with their dollars and pounds for the establishment of Guyana's first national suicide hotline. The major organization in Guyana doing community work around suicide is an NGO, the Guyana Foundation, which was established in 2013 and is run and funded by overseas Guyanese. The Guyana Foundation's managing director, Anthony Autar, a former New York lawyer, observed that in attempting to decrease suicide rates in Guyana, the foundation had to do seemingly unrelated socioeconomic work, like providing solar panels to people living without electricity. By contrast to expat and local activists, the Guyana government's major response to the 2014 suicide rate was the, quote, storage cabinet project, wherein the Ministry of Agriculture's Pesticides and Toxic Chemicals Control Board promised to distribute pesticide storage cabinets with locks to farmers who won a lottery with the aim of limiting accessibility and encouraging safe use. In the first year, 2014 to 2015, 10 farmers received these cabinets, with the total number distributed said to be only 150. The same Pesticides Board helpfully noted for Pesticide Awareness Week 2013, which is the last time the event seems to have been held, that improper, quote, improper storage of pesticides can lead to pesticides fires, spills, and accidental poisonings such as suicide. You know, this is Caribbean magical realism. People commit suicide by drinking poison, so the government stages a lottery to award lockers to store the poison. I'll conclude by restating that addressing the complex causes of the extraordinarily high Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese suicide rate cannot be disaggregated from its colonial history of indentured plantation labor and gender inequity. Guyanese need immediate help and education on the ground, but to do it effectively, the interrelated causes require further historical interrogation. In the meantime, as music is our lifeblood, the popular Indo-Guyanese chutney musicians Terry Gadraj and Anissa Singh, known as Princess Anissa, wrote a ballad in 2014 to address the suicide epidemic. The single was entitled Love is the Answer. Here are some video stills, and in the interest of time, I won't play it, but you can listen on YouTube. I have some doubts about the message of love being the answer to suicide and a legacy of plantation violence, but the song is heartfelt, albeit maudlin, and different from the artist's usual dance club fare. Unlike the government of Guyana, they're at least trying to reach their people to stem the tide of the indentureship legacy of violence that dates from that first May 5th, 1838, when we arrived. Thank you.
Thank you so much to you. Thank you for that fascinating talk. Can I ask you, our attendees, if you have any questions for our three panelists this afternoon, if you'd be kind enough to pop them in the Q&A, the box that you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screens, and I will happily put them to the panelists. Could I ask also if Kristen and Christopher would put their, or in fact, all the afternoon panelists, if you kindly put your cameras and microphones on. Thank you so much. I've got a couple of questions for Christopher first. Mohammed wants to know, what did music represent during Jose processions?
Yeah, I mean, the general gist is, of course, the music itself. And well, let's use the Trinidad example. In Trinidad, the drumming is meant to represent a narrative about the martyrdom of Hussein, right? The music itself is meant to be a progression, so it's meant to tell a story in that sense. So the Tassa repertoire for Jose is quite different from the repertoire for example, Hindu weddings. Yeah.
And David Dabydeen has a question for you, Christopher. He's asking what you thought about Derek Walcott's Nobel speech, which began and ended with descriptions of the Ram Leela in Trinidad and its dramatization of the Ramayana. He says he thought it was a major moment in Indo-Caribbean culture. Such a significant poet writing so vividly about this cultural event.
Yeah, so I mean, what is there to say? There's a in the speech, as I recall, he discusses sort of discovering Ram Leela, right? Kind of as an outsider and approaching it, and he's attracted to the colors, I think, right? So the colors of it, the vibrancy of it, of the performance, right? And then he moves from discussions of colors and sort of flashy things toward a discussion of theater, of course. So it becomes theater. And then he moves from a discussion of theater to a reminder that it's not just theater, but it's religious devotion, right? So Ram Leela as theater is also sort of a theatrical devotion, if I recall correctly. And so I'm assuming that David is asking about links between sort of the reenactment, the annual reenactment of Ram Leela, and how that maybe links to what I discussed in terms of reenacting Indian arrival. And of course, in an earlier version of the paper, I actually mentioned that toward the end. I took it out for this part, for this presentation. But linking together, things like Ram Leela and Jose, which are annual reenactments and annual embodiments of history and religious devotion, and linking that to the idea of how Indian arrival and those sort of practices that surround Indian arrival and remembrance and commemoration almost move to a point of religious devotion, kind of, right? It becomes an almost religious thing to reenact, right? I don't know, I'm just kind of stumbling over my words, but I hope that makes sense, yeah. So to shortly answer his question, I mean, it's obviously a very important moment, and as Walcott describes this moment, but it's also one that I think is important because it's an outsider. It's hard to say that Walcott is an outsider talking about Caribbean culture, but he is in this moment. And I think that's what makes it so effective. And as he speaks of sort of the fragments of identity and how they're put together in interesting ways.
Thank you. Can I say to the three of you, you've got some really, I don't know, because when you're presenting, you don't necessarily look in the chat, of course, but you've got some really lovely comments and many people thanking you for 3 excellent papers. And everybody has enjoyed them so much. Can I just give you, Ali, I've got a comment here, really more than a question, but I just want to share it with you. A gentleman has written here that that was a presentation that was poignant to the need for cultural psychiatry, suicide, self-harm, depression, and other mental health needs. And he says that the priority must be to decriminalize suicide and self-harm. Mm-hmm. Mentions that suicide rates in Guyana are similar to those of India.
They are similar. I mean, you know, standardized for age, and also, you know, the fact that Guyana is a very small country with less than 1 million people, and with more people living abroad than living in the country itself, the rate in Guyana is higher. But yes, that's true that suicide rates in India are also high. And there is something there to be said for religious pressure, and like religious and cultural pressure interlinked in some kind of ways that can't be desegregated as one cause of the high suicide rates in Guyana amongst Indo-Guyanese men in particular. I saw that somebody else also mentioned in the chat, or asked the question of, you know, why is it that Afro-Guyanese are not, suicide rates amongst Afro-Guyanese are not so high? I mean, you know, like as I said, I think there are multiple because Afro-Guyanese, similarly like Indo-Guyanese people, are, you know, the poverty rate is really high in Guyana for everyone. It's not just people of Indian descent. That is certainly true. But I think that some of the religious and cultural pressures some of the religious and cultural pressures that accrue to Indian people in Guyana are a little bit different. And two, also, very, very importantly, it is Indo-Guyanese people who still live, for the most part, in proximity to the former sugar estates and that are involved in farming in rural areas. The access is different. So Indo-Guyanese they're involved more in farming still, and they have greater access to farming chemicals.
Thanks so much. Thank you. I've got an interesting question here. Kristen, somebody said that your paper was really excellent, amazing, and asked if you're writing a monograph on Girl Zero.
Yes, at least that's the ambition. First, I have to finish my other monograph, which will hopefully be done within the next few months. And then if I can get out of the United States and into the archives, I hope this is the start of a second book project that looks at why it is that the traffic in women persists long after the nominal abolition of human trafficking and forced migration and slavery and so forth.
Kristen, you've won the award for Best Background today, far and away. Can I also ask you, Kristen, this question is right up my street. Michael Mitchell would like to know, is there any creative writing treatment of the Girl Zero case?
So I don't know of anything that discusses Girl Zero. Most people sort of overlook her or bury her in discussing all of the men involved in the case. So this is something I want to explore more deeply, though, particularly in manga. I'm really curious how this case has been depicted in manga in Japan, which is one of those great sort of hybrid media, both it's like comics, but actually much more serious than most comics in the West in a lot of cases. It's cartoons, but it can also be pretty profound sort of historical texts. So I'd be very curious to see if there are any depictions of the girl in the cabin in any of those treatments, but I haven't found any yet.
Thank you. A question for Aliyah, referring to Gayatri Bahadur's eye-opening work, Coolie Woman, you mention, you mentioned in your presentation, do you think the significant proportion of male versus female immigrant numbers in Indenture amplified the social pressure that historically led to desperate males to commit suicide, which according to Bahadur regularly happened after wife killings?
Yeah, you know, and one disturbing trend to notice is that in domestic violence cases that involve homicides in the Indo-Caribbean community, that is a pattern that persists into the current day, and including in diasporic communities, diasporic Indo-Caribbean communities in North America and in the United Kingdom, that men tend to kill their wives and then kill themselves. Like it just continues to happen. And I don't want to speculate on exactly why it happens in diaspora too, but it continues to happen. I think the question was about gender demographic difference. So yes, of course, it's linked. You know, I don't know about necessarily desperate Indian male immigrants, but certainly like depression, right? Like lack of familial connections, isolation, lack of familial connections are reasons why people might take this path. overwork, labor. There is no single cause, is something that I really want to emphasize for this high suicide rate, both in the colonial era and in the present.
Thank you so much. Somebody else said, thank you so much for the talk. Wondering whether shame as an aspect of ancestral trauma, if you think that continues to play a role in suicides in Indo-Caribbean communities in Guyana.
Yeah, I guess it would depend on how you define ancestral trauma, right? And to what extent you think memory is carried forward and how it is carried forward, right? Like, is it in the bones? Is it in the blood, or is it oral family histories, or how is it that it's perpetuated? I certainly think gender mores and strictures are, perpetuated through the family and generationally, and that, yes, they're linked. I can't say specifically, I'm not sure exactly how I would say that they're linked, but they are linked because ideas about gender are, one thing that I wanted to pick up on, I think in your previous question or comment, is that there is so little data on this, like so little like comprehensive sociological studies of who is doing it and why they're doing it and so on, that a lot of it is speculation. And one thing that we should really one thing to really need to explore more is this idea, this anecdata idea that women in fact Indo-Guyanese women attempt suicide more, but fail more. It's simply that Indo-Guyanese men, take it to completion more often. We don't know. There are hardly any statistics. And as I said, attempted suicide is a crime. So people might be less inclined to report it.
Thank you so much. Somebody's missed part of your talk, but was wondering how popular culture, particularly chutney music, contributed to trends of alcohol abuse and self-harm, saying that this song, My Johnny Walker, songs mentioning alcohol seem to be a running trend.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we could blame, popular music for a host of social ills, but I'm not necessarily inclined to do that. I think you can find culpability almost anywhere you look. It is true that, the youth and a lot of people listen to chutney, but it doesn't mean that it's a causal factor, or perhaps, yeah, it's not causal. But yeah, I'm not inclined to blame popular music as a cause. It's already there is something that I want to, I really want to emphasize. It's already there in the colonial legacy of violence. People were already Indo-Guyanese people were already committing suicide at really high rates, like on the plantation, and that's carried forward in the absence of chutney music or any music at all.
Sure. Thank you. I've got a question here for Kirsten, which is, it's interesting, I think, in light of the hostility that British historians are currently receiving because of their own delving into the imperial archives. Kristen, somebody wants to know if you have received any hostility in Japan because of your research.
Well, this project is new, so I have an article on Girl Zero that's forthcoming. It'll be out in several months, but so far, no, they don't know to be angry at me yet. I'm very certain, though. I have a number of friends who work on comfort women and human trafficking, and they get really intense and relentless online abuse. Fortunately, it's all online so far. So I feel like that's part of my future. I'm just walking straight into it, but we have to do what we have to do.
Can I just say I'm so grateful to the three of you for those excellent papers. As I said to Nalini, we really appreciate that all academics that are teaching under immense pressure because of the pandemic. So it means a lot to us that you carved out time to work on your papers and to be here with us today. Thank you very, very much. So I mean, all panelists, and can I ask tech support also, if you kindly if everybody could put their camera on for me. You can leave your mics off if you want to. Just to say thank you. I want to say thank you so much to everyone, but in particular, can I just say a special thank you to my colleague Eve, whose name is Tech Support. Eve has been tremendous. I actually suffered a bereavement last week, and Eve has kind of picked me up and carried me through the whole process of getting this on Zoom and working and functioning. So my kind of heartfelt thanks to her, and to all of you for coming here to our audience. I really hope that this isn't the last time that I see you all. And I really hope that we can do this in person very soon as well. And I wish the best to our attendees. A huge thank you to our participants. Thank you so much for joining us all today. Many, many thanks, everyone.